Good evening, morning. What are some other times of day? Twilight, dusk, dawn, whenever you happen to be listening. Welcome to the show. This is Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclast, the podcast. And I'm your host, Mike Lucht. And this is the unofficial final episode of the Megalopolimancy trilogy. This has been a rough one, particularly compared to most episodes, because I've had to do a couple rewrites on this. So hopefully it turns out okay. It's coming out a little later than I would have preferred, but hey, fuck it, we're here. Let's jump right in. The Jack the Ripper murders have fascinated us for over a century. But what if we've been asking the wrong questions? What if these weren't just the work of some lone madman or just your common run-of-the-mill, everyday mom-and-pop serial killer? What if they were something far more profound? Convergence of state power, secret societies, black magic, I love it, and mathematical obsession that transformed London itself into a massive altar. And that right there is going to tell you how this fits into the grander scheme at large of the whole overarching megalopolimancy idea, using the city as a vast ritual altar, essentially. Your prototype mega ritual. Now, before we can map this grand design, we must dismantle the mundane explanations that the modern establishment uses to close the case. Today, mainstream forensics points triumphantly to Aaron Kosminski, a poor Polish-Jewish immigrant whose guilt supposedly rests on recent DNA testing of a silk shawl found near the body of Catherine Eddowes. Now, not to besmirch this poor woman's, 100-plus year memory, but finding someone's DNA on a item owned by a woman who was a lady of the night, we'll say, that's not a big, it's not doing it for me. I don't put a lot of stock into that particular explanation, but whatever. This tidy narrative completely crumbles under the weight of reality. Not only has the chain of custody for this artifact been compromised for over a century, but the science itself is deeply flawed. To put it plainly, the garments of a Victorian-era East End prostitute, or sex worker, I'm going to try. I'm trying to get more in the habit of doing that. Okay. Would naturally be saturated with the biological traces of countless individuals, attempting to isolate a definitive killer from a shawl that was essentially a canvas of environmental and professional contamination is a forensic fantasy, a desperate attempt to reduce a cosmic anomaly to a simple street crime. I know, cosmic anomaly, it's a bit of a grandiose term for what we're going into here. Just roll with me. In the broader arena of monumental historical whodunits, this sudden aggressive rush to declare a final solution is a well-worn pattern of misdirection. When the establishment or the media begins to shout a definitive answer from the rooftops, the sheer sound and fury of their proclamations rarely signals a triumph of truth. Rather, it often functions as structural propaganda or a frantic smokescreen indicating that independent researchers are getting uncomfortably close to a far more complex and darker reality. At least this is the narrative that, for our purposes going forward, we're going to indulge. The louder they yell that the mystery is solved, the more it feels as though they're actively trying to hide something. And I do stand behind this idea. Like, I feel this way with a lot of stuff. Like, the minute that someone is saying, like, this is what it is, we got it, like, especially if it's something that's been a century-plus mystery, like, I don't know. It just, methinks the horse doth protest too much, or however the old saying goes. Anyways, pushing a convenient scapegoat to shut down inquiry. It's, especially since this man is a Jew, which will come into play later. But historically, these sudden bursts of absolute finality serve to protect those with the most to lose, suggesting that the true answers are deeply damning to elite institutions or figures of immense power who remain invisibly tethered to the very forces proclaiming that there's nothing left to see. Move it along now, nothing to see here. So in this episode, we'll explore the Ripper murders as the ultimate occult mega-ritual, a citywide hyper-sigil designed to open doors between worlds and reshape the fate of a nation, if not civilization. We'll examine the evidence for sacred geometry encoded in the murder sites, the possibility of state-sponsored terror masquerading as quote-unquote random violence. It's that's a big one for me today with a lot of the just the way things are in America the last decade or two, and even explore the most controversial theory of all, that the mind behind these murders belonged to none other than, and I love this part, Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, better known as Lewis Carroll, celebrated author of both Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There. So lock your doors, draw your curtains, and most definitely cover up your mirrors as we prepare to see the Whitechapel murders, not as a case study in criminal pathology, but as a masterwork of urban occultism that may have altered reality itself. So let's begin with what might be the most plausible, yet almost totally overlooked theory, that Jack the Ripper wasn't a supernatural entity or a cult practitioner at all, but rather a state-sponsored assassin conducting psychological warfare on London's population. I will try to get all my sources listed in episode as well. There was a lot, so hopefully I got them all, or get them all. Tom Sleeman's Jack the Ripper, Secret Service. His hypothesis states that Jack was a covert agent carrying out a brutal campaign to dismantle both Fenian and anarchist networks threatening Queen Victoria's realm. The core suspect in this scenario is a man named Claude Regnier Condor, I believe that's how you say it, who was a military officer and explorer with precisely the skills and connections needed to move unseen through London's underworld, strike with surgical precision, and manipulate the investigation. Far from a common soldier, Condor was a brilliant polymath, an officer in the elite Royal Engineers, and a distinguished explorer who led the high-profile Palestine Exploration Fund surveys. Keep that name in your back pocket, because they will be showing up again. This unique background provided him with a formidable, lethal skill set that perfectly matched the operational requirements of the Whitechapel assassin. As a military surveyor, he possessed a masterly understanding of cartography, topography, and the mathematical mapping of physical space, which allowed him to navigate and exploit the dense, confusing, labyrinthian East End slums with absolute spatial precision. Furthermore, his extensive years conducting covert intelligence gathering operations in the volatile terrains of the Middle East, yep, even back then, always has been a let's go with hornet's nest. That's the friendly way to put it. It's transformed him into a expert in deep cover surveillance, psychological warfare, and linguistic infiltration, enabling him to blend seamlessly into the multilingual immigrant populations of Whitechapel. I put this first because this is the non-supernatural one, but I thought it deserved ear time because it is. You never hear the really weird theories. Everyone wants to concentrate on what it is. So by that virtue, all the explicitly weird shit just gets pushed to the side because, like, that's too weird. That couldn't be it. Like, well, why not? Weird shit happens. Whatever. Anyways, get off my soapbox. Anyways, Condor's professional and personal connections also placed him at the absolute nexus of late Victorian institutional power, secret societies, and elite intelligence networks. He was deeply embedded within the British military establishment and maintained close ties to the highest echelons of the state apparatus, making him an ideal instrument for a deniable, state-sanctioned counter-terrorism operation. At least that's what they would call this, in their... that's how they would view this operation, quote-unquote operation. Crucially, Condor was a highly placed member of the Freemasons. Yep, they're in there. They're going to be in here a lot. They always are. Kind of weird. No, they show up in damn near every Jack the Ripper theory. It's like, well, why is that? Huh. Anywho. Specifically associated with, and keep this name in your back pocket as well, the Quattuor Coronati Lodge, who will most definitely be showing up again later on in this episode to an even heavier degree. This was a elite research lodge that was deeply interested in ancient architecture, sacred geometry, and esoteric symbolism. And this elite fraternal network provided him with a dual layer of protection, connecting him directly to high-ranking police officials and government ministers who shared the same oaths of secrecy and brotherhood. Through these powerful alliances, Condor had the unique ability to influence the inner workings of the Metropolitan Police and Scotland Yard from behind the scenes, ensuring that any clues pointing toward a state-sponsored or ritualistically precise executioner were quietly suppressed, altered, or permanently erased from the official record. And I'm sorry to keep, interrupting the primary narrative here, but if this episode goes long, there may be since this is the final Megalopolimancy bit, there may be an addendum to this. So I'm going to try and get it all in one. There's a lot of stuff to cover. Back to it. To fully grasp why Jack the Ripper's reign of terror was so politically potent, it helps to understand the intense, borderline, paranoid atmosphere of late Victorian London. The quote-unquote revolutionary elements mentioned were not abstract political debaters. They were active, militant factions using violence to disrupt the heart of the British Empire. The Fenians, primarily organized under the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or the IRB, were Irish nationalists dedicated to overthrowing British rule in Ireland and establishing an independent republic. Throughout the 1880s, they executed a calculated and terrifying dynamite campaign across the British mainland. It's effective. I'll give it that, I would never want to see anyone hurt from political violence, but a dynamite campaign does sound mighty effective. Their motives were clear. Leverage asymmetric warfare to terrorize the British public, paralyze government infrastructure, and force the state to concede to Irish independence. They didn't just target military outposts. They struck the very symbols of British power and civilian life. Fenian bombs tore through the London Underground, Westminster Abbey, the Tower of London, and even Scotland Yard itself. To the average Londoner in 1888, terrorism was a vivid, day-to-day reality, and the Fenians were viewed as an existential threat, capable of destabilizing the empire from within. Simultaneously, the anarchist movement was gaining massive traction across Europe and bleeding into London, particularly within the impoverished immigrant communities of the East End. This is back when people took anarchists seriously. There used to be a phrase that everyone used back in these days, bomb-throwing anarchist. That phrase has kind of disappeared from our lexicon of present day. So, driven by an anti-authoritarian ideology that sought the total dissolution of capitalism and the state, many radical anarchists adhered to the concept of, quote-unquote, propaganda of the deed. This is something that's been, this has been reappropriated by terrorists. That's what anyone who goes by, quote-unquote, propaganda of the deed, who utilizes this, is often associated with or termed today. This philosophy dictated that political change couldn't be achieved through rhetoric alone, but through provocative, violent acts, such as bombings and assassinations, that would shock the working class into a state of revolution. Because London was a haven for political refugees fleeing persecution throughout continental Europe, the British government feared the East End was a breeding ground for an international lawless uprising that threatened to dismantle the social hierarchy entirely. This is where the terror of 1888 intersects with state anxiety. The Fenians and anarchists were highly organized, deeply ideological, and explicitly targeting the state to project an intensely symbolic sense of power. By contrast, a killer like Jack the Ripper completely inverted this dynamic. By terrorizing the exact slums where radical immigrants and anarchists thought were festering, quote-unquote festering, the Ripper murders effectively paralyzed the neighborhood with a different kind of fear. A seemingly supernatural phantom killer, creating a state of chaotic vulnerability that completely broke the momentum of political organizing. It reminded the revolutionary elements that, for all their grand schemes of tearing down the empire, they were utterly defenseless against an incomprehensible, localized violence that the police could neither predict nor contain. In this framework, the Ripper's ritualistic mutilations serve not occult ends, but the aims of psychological warfare. The infamous Goulston Street graffito. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing, takes on new meaning as a coded signal, perhaps indicating which targets had been neutralized or warning other agents to stay clear. The esoteric elements of the murders, the specific mutilations, the timings, the locations, become tools of statecraft rather than witchcraft. Each killing serves multiple purposes, eliminating specific individuals who may have been connected to revolutionary groups, creating a climate of fear that makes organizing more difficult and potentially drawing attention away from other covert operations that may be taking place right over in the same area in the exact same time. This theory explains why the murders stopped so abruptly once they had served their purpose, quote unquote, and why the investigations never produced a viable suspect. If Condor or someone like him was indeed operating with government backing, the authorities would have had every reason to ensure the case remained unsolved, maintaining the mystique of an unstoppable supernatural killer while their actual objectives were achieved. What makes this theory particularly compelling is how it accounts for the ritualistic elements without requiring us to believe in black magic or interdimensional entities, etc. The precision of the cuts, the removal of specific organs, the timing of the murders, all of these aspects could be explained as psychological operations designed to maximize terror while sending specific messages to targeted groups. The Freemasonic connections that many researchers have identified might not indicate the killer's membership in such societies, but rather his knowledge of their symbolism and rituals, which he appropriated for his own purposes. By incorporating Masonic elements, he could create additional confusion and misdirection, potentially even framing secret societies to further obscure the true nature of the operation. This isn't to say that the state-sponsored terrorism theory explains everything about the Ripper murders, far from it, but it does provide a framework for understanding how seemingly occult elements might be employed for entirely practical political ends. A theme we'll see reoccurring as we explore other theories. The overlap and intermingling of intelligence networks and occultism is a long, rich history that... oh my goodness. It's something I'll attempt to get into here and there, but God, just a fucking mass overhaul or mass overlook of the entire thing, I wouldn't know where to begin. It's the big one. This is another idea I ran across, another theory behind the murders that I thought was interesting. One of the more plausible ones. Among the most intellectually compelling frameworks within the lexicon of Ripperology is the theory of Jack the Social Reformer, a hypothesis that shifts the motives entirely away from localized sexual sadism and into the realm of radical, weaponized socio-political engineering. This theory was famously and most sharply posited by none other than the legendary Irish playwright, critic, and staunch socialist, plus real piece of shit, George Bernard Shaw. In a scathing, deeply satirical letter published to the Star newspaper on September 24th, 1888, just after the murder of Annie Chapman, Shaw observed that while the affluent ruling classes of London had spent decades contentedly ignoring the utter misery, disease, and starvation of the East End slums, the gruesome butcheries of Whitechapel had accomplished what a century of peaceful political activism could not. Shaw ironically suggested that the murderer was a radical genius who had chosen to quote-unquote reform society by utilizing the ultimate capitalistic asset, the media, to generate a wave of quote-unquote bourgeois panic, so absolute that the state would be forced to intervene in the living conditions of the outcast and the poor out of sheer, desperate self-preservation. Viewed through this lens, the Ripper campaign wasn't an outburst of chaotic bloodlust, but a meticulously targeted operation designed to shock the conscience of the British Empire by shining a blinding theatrical spotlight on its most rotting foundations. In 1888, the slums of Whitechapel and Spitalfields were essentially massive, dense human warehouses overflowing with disease, overpopulation, and staggering poverty, where thousands of women were driven to casual, everyday sex work simply to secure a fourpence bed for the night. By executing these marginalized women with spectacular, unforgettable savagery in very public places, the perpetrator turned the grotesque nature of the crimes into an unavoidable societal mirror. The strategy worked with immediate historical precision. The murders triggered a massive influx of philanthropic funding, forced the demolition of some of the city's worst tenement rookeries, and accelerated the passage of landmark urban housing reforms. In a deeply twisted application of the concept of a quote-unquote necessary evil, the killer effectively used 5 human lives as raw sacrificial fuel to alter the socio-economic trajectory of hundreds of thousands of London's forgotten citizens. Simultaneously, these theories extend into a darker, more Machiavellian dimension regarding the strategic expansion of the state's apparatus of control. The late 1880s were marked by severe social friction, massive worker strikes, and constant demonstrations by socialist and anarchist groups, culminating in the violent clashes of Bloody Sunday in late 1887, which left the public deeply, deeply distrustful of the police. Not a lot's changed there. However, the sheer paralyzing atmosphere of terror generated by the Ripper completely flipped this dynamic on its head. So within weeks, the terrified population of the East End went from actively rioting against police authority to desperately begging, oh please, for a massive, heavily funded, and permanent police presence in their streets. By creating a threat so alien and horrifying that it transcended standard political lines, the mastermind provided the perfect, indisputable justification for the government to establish an unprecedented, militarized intelligence and policing grid over the volatile working-class districts. Whether the killer was an independent radical executing a bloody shortcut to social reform, or a shadow agent of the state creating a prerequisite for authoritarian surveillance, the results were identical. The bodies in the fog became the foundational stepping stones for the modernization of the entire London police force. So that's the more that's before we get into the woo stuff. Those are the more plausible. These are going to get progressively weird as we go through. So while the Black Ops theory, and perhaps to a lesser extent the social reformer theory, offer a quote-unquote rational explanation for the Ripper murders, the shadow of genuine black magic and secret societies has always clung to this case. For many researchers, the evidence points not to a government agent, but a practitioner of ritual magic attempting to harness the city's energy for supernatural purposes. Robert Donston Stevenson, who operated under the alias Rosalind de Onston, serves as one of the most polarizing figures in the history of quote-unquote Ripperology. While skeptics point to his tendency for self-mythologizing and his penchant for inserting himself into the police investigation, which serial killers like to do, proponents like Ivor Edwards and Spiro Demolianus argue that his background perfectly positioned him as a practitioner of high-stakes occultism. Stevenson's own accounts, many of which remain unverified and heavily embellished, paint a portrait of a man obsessed with the esoteric from a young age. Stevenson claimed that during a stint in Paris in 1859, he met the celebrated novelist and occultist Lord Edward Bulwer Lytton. According to Stevenson's later writings, this meeting resulted in his initiation into the Hermetic Lodge of Alexandria. While no formal records confirm the lodge's existence in the way he described, the association with Bulwer Lytton, a powerhouse of Victorian literature and esoteric thought, provided him with instant credibility in occult circles. Stevenson's interests were eclectic and extreme. He claimed to have traveled to Africa to study what they called back in the day Obeaism, which is a derogatory colonial term for obeah, and various forms of indigenous witchcraft. Obeah itself is a complex, multifaceted spiritual and sorcerous practice that originated among enslaved West Africans in the Caribbean, most notably in Jamaica. Rooted in traditional African ancestor veneration, it involves the active manipulation of spiritual forces through the use of material charms, herbal medicines, and specific ritual ceremonies to either heal, protect, or inflict harm upon adversaries. In the eyes of British colonial authorities, obeah was viewed with intense terror as a malicious form of black magic and a potent catalyst for slave rebellions, leading to its strict criminalization across the empire. Whether Stevenson's journeys into these traditions actually occurred or were merely part of his elaborate persona, his writings demonstrated a genuine, albeit deeply unsettling, grasp of ritualistic theory. In pieces like African Magic, published in the Theosophical Journal Lucifer in 1890, he displayed a sophisticated knowledge of magical doctrine that few of his contemporaries possessed. Stevenson wasn't merely a lone eccentric. He maneuvered through circles where the occult and the literary avant-garde intersected. In the early 1890s, Stevenson entered a business venture with the writer Mabel Collins and a woman named Vittoria Kremers. Collins was a prominent figure in the Theosophical movement and a collaborator of the legendary occultist Helena Blavatsky. That a man suspected of being a serial killer was operating in the same professional and social orbits as one of the most famous occult writers in London suggests a startling proximity to the era's spiritual elite. Supposedly, Crowley said that that Blavatsky was the Ripper. I don't know if anyone took that seriously. If anyone did, back when he said it, they probably weren't quite getting it. Perhaps the most compelling, if controversial, link is to Crowley himself. In the 1920s, Crowley boasted that he possessed a blood-stained necktie that had belonged to the Ripper, a man he identified as a black magician and a surgeon, namely Stevenson. Crowley claimed to have known Stevenson personally, asserting that the Ripper's murders weren't random acts of violence, but a calculated ritual sequence intended to grant the practitioners the power of invisibility through the sacrifice of 7 women in a specific geometric pattern. For researchers like Edwards and Demolianis, the Ripper wasn't a common thug, but a man utilizing a specific archaic framework of violence. Stevenson possessed the 3 necessary components. Medical proficiency. He was trained in medicine and surgery. He possessed the anatomical knowledge to perform the precise mutilations found on the victims. This technical background elevates Stevenson from a simple, bloodthirsty predator to an operator capable of working with chilling efficiency under the cover of pitch darkness. According to contemporary post-mortem reports by police surgeons like Dr. Phillips and Dr. Bond, the Whitechapel killer demonstrated a sophisticated, practiced hand, capable of cleanly separating pelvic joints, extracting intact organs, and making sweeping single-stroke incisions that avoided hitting bone. Stevenson's early training as a military doctor in France, combined with his experience treating battlefield wounds and performing emergency amputations under chaotic conditions, meant he possessed the muscle memory and raw psychological detachment required to execute such rapid, expert dissections in the freezing night air of an alleyway. Furthermore, this medical proficiency feeds directly into the esoteric theory that the mutilations were deliberate anatomical extractions rather than the random hacks of a lunatic. To an accomplished surgeon who was also a high-level occultist, the human body was a map of spiritual energy centers. Stevenson's unique dual expertise would allow him to locate and excise specific organs, such as the uterus or the kidneys, with surgical accuracy in a matter of minutes, treating the crime scenes as a dark open-air laboratory. His deep familiarity with human dissection meant he knew exactly how much force to apply and where to cut to minimize noise and blood splatter, allowing him to perform complex anatomical extractions in the dark before the police patrols could even make their rounds. Bullet splatter, bullet splatter. Geographical opportunity. By checking himself into the London hospital in Whitechapel in July 1888, just as the murders began, he placed himself at the epicenter of the crimes, despite his claims of being an invalid. Esoteric and true crime theorists argue that this institutionalization wasn't a restrictive confinement, but rather the ultimate operational camouflage. Far from being a bedridden patient, Stevenson allegedly utilized his background as a former military surgeon to manipulate the hospital staff and exploit the very lax night shift routine. That's putting it lightly, I'm sure, of a chaotic, understaffed Victorian medical facility. Because he had checked in voluntarily under the vague diagnosis of neurasthenia, which was a catch-all term for nervous exhaustion, he was granted a coveted private room in the Curie ward, affording him a level of privacy that general ward patients never enjoyed. Within this framework, theorists believe that he was essentially a free agent who could slip into a dark overcoat, navigate the hospital's crazy rear exits, and just step directly onto the foggy streets of Whitechapel, completely unnoticed. Makes sense to me. I don't know. I'm not saying it's him. Just, this is one of the more... This guy makes a little more sense to me. I don't know. This setup effectively provided him with the perfect ironclad alibi. Who would ever suspect a man officially recorded as a patient under constant medical supervision? That's in quotes, by the way. Quote unquote, constant medical supervision. Once again, just put yourself in the mind space of what a late 1800s Victorian hospital must be like. They weren't too far from, sticking leeches on people at this point still, too. The geographical precision of this theory becomes terrifyingly apparent when looking at the map of the Autumn of Terror, as they call it. The very first canonical murder site, where Mary Ann Nichols was found eviscerated in Bucks Row, sat a mere 150 yards north of the London hospital grounds, a distance that could be covered on foot in less than 2 minutes. After executing his slaughter, Stevenson would have had no need to slip past police checkpoints or wash blood from his hands in a crowded lodging house. Instead, he could simply slip back through a shadow-drenched hospital backside door, melt back into the familiar corridors of the institution where the sight of a apron stained with blood or anatomical matter would not really, no one would really cast aspersions on that. Not the passing staff, at least. And then return to the privacy and safety of his bed before the night watch discovered his work. The third factor would be the psychological profile. Stevenson's writings often betrayed an intimate, almost voyeuristic knowledge of the killer's mindset. He was, as authors have noted, the only suspect who essentially, quote-unquote, wrote the manual on the crimes while they were still happening, constantly feeding the press with theories that conveniently kept him at the heart of the narrative. This compulsive need to intellectualize the slaughter goes far beyond simple true crime curiosity. It suggests that the highly specific psychological profile of a killer who couldn't resist the urge to admire his own handiwork through the public lens. Writing under his journalistic pseudonym, Rosalind Onston, he published blistering, deeply detailed analyses in major newspapers like the Pall Mall Gazette, $10 a pack. In these pieces, he didn't just guess at motives. He practically guided the public's imagination, breaking down the exact anatomical precision of the cuts and confidently explaining why the police were failing to catch the culprit. Now keep in mind, what we know about serial killers today, they love to insert themselves into the investigation whenever possible. So there's that idea, but it's also the fact that he's attempting to control the narrative, essentially. This is another big point. By stepping into the role of the master investigator, Stevenson was able to hide his dark obsession in plain sight, transforming his voyeuristic thrill into respectable journalism. Quote-unquote respectable journalism. He became an indispensable consultant to the press, effectively controlling the flow of the narrative from the inside. This behavior matches a classic narcissistic trait seen in highly intelligent offenders, the absolute need to be recognized as the smartest person in the room. Yeah, you know a little something about that, wouldn't you, Mike? Hey, fuck you, me. No, it's true. By feeding the media highly complex theories, including the idea that the murders were a series of calculated black magic sacrifices based on ancient sorcery, he wasn't just throwing the police off the scent. He was dropping deliberate clues. For Stevenson, the newspaper column became an extension of the crime scene itself, a psychological playground where he could openly gloat about the grand design while remaining entirely untouchable behind a wall of ink and paper. By weaving this intricate black magic framework directly into the mainstream media, Stevenson may have been doing something far more sophisticated than simply deflecting suspicion. He may have been orchestrating a massive, calculated, psychological and occult operation. We've discussed them before in this series, but egregores are distinct, non-physical entities or focused energy force that is consciously willed into existence through the collective belief, emotional investment, and focused attention of a large group of people. By using his high-profile journalistic platform to systematically seed the public consciousness with the terrifying idea of a calculating, ritualistic magician stalking the foggy streets of Whitechapel, Stevenson effectively transformed millions of panicked, reading Londoners into unwitting participants in a massive citywide ritual. This was a psychological warfare operation, or PSYOP, if you prefer, if you're trying to save time, executed on an unprecedented imperial scale. Every sensationalized headline, every breathless discussion in a crowded pub, and every wave of pure terror that rippled through the capital acted as raw psychic fuel. By feeding this specific esoteric narrative to the masses, he took the raw chaotic horror of the street crimes and structured it, channeling the collective fear, paranoia, and morbid fascination of an entire empire to breathe life into a monstrous, shared psychic entity. The Ripper, under this framework, ceased to be just a flesh and blood killer. He became an immortal cultural tulpa, a thought form constructed from the shadow side of the Victorian psyche. By manipulating the press to create this egregore, Stevenson achieved the ultimate occult victory. He permanently altered the reality grid of London, embedding a dark, transcendent mythos so deeply into the global subconscious that it continues to broadcast its unsettling frequency over a century later. Ultimately, this manipulation of the public mind suggests a terrifying final phase to the operation: the deliberate tethering of that massive psychic entity back to its creator. If Stevenson was indeed the architect behind the scalpel, he didn't just create a monster in the newspapers to scare the public. He engineered an immortal, self-mythologizing armor. In the mechanics of high-level sorcery, a thought form fueled by the terror of millions possesses a staggering amount of raw, concentrated power. By guiding the narrative so precisely from behind his typewriter, Stevenson could systematically draw that raging ocean of public energy back toward himself, effectively drinking in the psychic harvest to achieve a twisted form of spiritual apotheosis. Through this calculated feedback loop, the mortal man, Rosalind Dawston, was able to step into the shadow of the very egregore he'd conjured, permanently fusing his own consciousness with the immortal myth of the Ripper. He successfully transformed a series of brief historical atrocities into a permanent transtemporal monument of dark divinity. It was the ultimate act of predatory esotericism, using the collective minds of the British Empire as a womb to give birth to a dark god, and then stepping inside the skin of that god. It created a profound cosmic joke that only Stevenson, and maybe a couple other people who might have been on the fringes of awareness, ever truly understood. While the world spent the next century fruitlessly digging through the mud of Whitechapel for a common street thug, the true perpetrator had already ascended, safely hidden in plain sight, having achieved total immortality by becoming the literal ghost in the global cultural machine. While the Dawston theory remains a subject of intense debate, his life acts as a dark prism for the era, reflecting the Victorian fascination with the intersection of science, medicine, and the forbidden mysteries of the occult. To fully grasp the chilling audacity of the Dawston as Ripper hypothesis, oh boy, one must look directly at the intricate metaphysical scaffolding constructed by researchers Ivor Edwards and Spiro Demolianis. And if I'm getting that last name wrong, Spiro, I totally apologize. Moving on. In their deep dive analyses, the Whitechapel murders cease to be a series of disconnected, localized tragedies and are instead revealed as a tightly engineered, high-level piece of sorcerous machinery. So here's the expanded, highly detailed breakdown of the actual mechanics, theory, and practice of this urban mega ritual as laid out across the 4 operational phases. Phase 1, the blueprint and geometric stalking. In this theoretical framework of Edwards and Demolianis, the entire campaign begins with a blueprint of absolute mathematical rigidity. Stevenson didn't look at Whitechapel as a collection of dark alleys, he viewed it as a blank occult canvas. The core theory relies on geomantic tethering, the deliberate act of forcing a fluid, non-physical cosmic gateway to anchor itself onto the hard material reality of physical geography. To achieve this, Stevenson used a classic piece of sacred geometry, the Vesica Piscis, or Vesica... I've heard several ways to say this, so just bear with me on it. But I'm going to go with Vesica Piscis, because that's what I saw the most people, but it's the Jesus fish shape, basically. Formed by the intersection of 2 circles with equal radii, where the center of each circle lies on the circumference of the other. This ancient symbol has traditionally represented the yoni, the vagina, the vesica, the cosmic birth canal. I think you get the idea. And a literal doorway between the material world and the unseen realms. In practice, this meant Stevenson was locked into a pre-calculated mathematical axis. He wasn't hunting specific individuals based on personal malice. He was hunting the coordinates themselves. The women were merely the biological keys required to unlock the locks that he'd mapped out on his charts. To execute this, he utilized the Tin Bells pub on Commercial Street not just as a watering hole, but as a tactical surveillance hub and psychological sorting house. Sitting at the literal heart of this geometric web, Stevenson could observe these transient street workers, gauge their vulnerability, and, perhaps most crucially, maneuver or guide them towards the precise geographic intersections where the overlapping arcs of his invisible circles converged. If a victim walked 50 yards outside of the geometric node, the ritual would fail. They had to be placed exactly on these mathematical crosshairs. Phase 2, the necromantic catalyst, a.k.a. the kill. In the mechanics of late Victorian black magic and Western Hermeticism, a portal cannot be opened by cold geometry alone. Static lines drawn on a map are inert. They require an immense, sudden, and highly concentrated release of vital life force energy, variously termed prana, chi, even memento, which is a new one I've recently learned. That's another word for the Force from Star Wars. It's all the same thing. I think you understand. To tear the veil between worlds, the act of murder was the spark that ignited the engine. The practice required absolute cold-blooded efficiency. According to the forensic analysis highlighted by the authors, the killer utilized a specific rapid method of execution. The throat was severed swiftly from left to right with a deep, heavy incision. This was done while the victim was either standing or in the immediate process of being lowered to the ground. This specific angle and velocity instantly severed the carotid arteries and the larynx, silencing the victim in a split second to prevent any public alarm. More importantly for the ritual, this precise method ensured that the pressurized arterial blood poured directly and rapidly downward into the earth at the designated geometric coordinate. This wasn't a messy byproduct of murder. It was the literal consecration of the soil. The blood acted as a metaphysical fluid conductor, binding the spiritual energy of the dying victim directly to the physical earth, effectively activating and anchoring that specific node of the Vesica Piscis grid. And then phase 3, anatomical transmutation, a.k.a. the mutilation. Once the ground was consecrated and the node anchored, the operational focus shifted from simple destruction to the extraction of what occultists term biological currency. Working in absolute pitch-black darkness, guided by a profound level of medical dexterity that contemporary observers and later occultists like Crowley himself noted must have been near superhuman, quote-unquote, the killer transitioned into an alchemical harvest. This was a highly calculated gathering of physical batteries, so to speak. You have your organ extracted, the esoteric target or significance, and the metaphysical function. So the womb, or uterus, this is the primordial generative matrix. This was needed to capture the pure, raw, creative, and manifesting energies of life itself. And you have the kidneys, the seat of vital prana and emotion, historically viewed in Western esoteric tradition as the filtering centers of human fear, survival instinct, and emotional essence. And then you have the heart and intestines, the central axis of consciousness, to completely dismantle the physical microcosm, aka the human body, to empower the macrocosm, or the ritual grid. According to Edwards' analysis, these organs were treated as literal spiritual capacitors. In the mechanics of necromancy, an organ retains its subtle ethereal charge only if it is harvested post-mortem but pre-cooling. In that brief, fleeting twilight state where the cells are dying but the lingering life force hasn't yet completely evaporated into the atmosphere. By cleanly and surgically excising these pieces in the dark, Stevenson was hoarding the concentrated biological essence of the victims to fuel the final transcendent phase of the machine. Then there's phase 4, completing the circuit. The final phase of the mega ritual demanded an absolute, unforgiving adherence to chronological and astrological timing. Each murder wasn't an isolated event, but a consecutive, bleeding line segment being drawn across the face of London to link the anchor nodes together. The terrifying operational speed of the double event on September 30th, the back-to-back slaughters of Elizabeth Stride in Duffield's Yard and Catherine Eddowes in the Meter Square. This was not a panicked mistake caused by the killer being interrupted. In the framework of Edwards and de Molianis, it was a deliberate, rapid-fire necessity. The geometric layout required a vital dual-point axis to be completed within a single specific lunar cycle to maintain the energetic tension of the overlapping circles. The grand design reached its horrific, definitive conclusion on November 9th with the total evisceration of Mary Jane Kelly inside the enclosed private confines of Miller's Court. While the previous victims were left in the open streets to disperse their energy into the city's thoroughfares, Kelly's slaughter was entirely contained. By performing the ultimate exhaustive dissection of the final victim inside a sealed room, Stevenson effectively closed the perimeter of the Vesica Piscis. The 4 previous street murders acted as the outer boundary lines, while Kelly's room served as the inner sanctum, the focal point where the intense, compressed energy of the entire hypersigil was funneled. By completing this final, total transmutation, the architect successfully sealed the ritualistic matrix, internalizing the massive, channeled, psychic, and biological power to achieve a permanent state of dark spiritual transcendence and self-deification. These precise alignments, symbolic mutilations, and reoccurring motifs, like the removal of specific organs, are read as evidence of necromantic rites, Masonic symbolism, and attempts to channel esoteric power through the city's very architecture. Meter Square, where Catherine Eddowes was killed, takes on new meaning as a reference to the meter of bishops or the Masonic square, while the double killing of September 30th creates a line that forms part of a larger geometric pattern. The ritualistic nature of the murders goes beyond mere symbolism. The swiftness of the attacks and the manner of the mutilations performed on some of the bodies, which included disembowelments and removal of organs, we're going to be straightforward here, led to speculation that the murderer had the skills of a physician or butcher. However, others disagreed strongly and thought the wounds too crude to be professional, perhaps suggesting they were ritualistic rather than practical in nature. The extraction of these specific organs, most notably the uterus, ovaries, and kidneys, carried deep significance within late Victorian esoteric and occult folklore. In the Western magical tradition, the uterus wasn't merely an anatomical feature, but the ultimate symbol of the generative matrix and the gateway of creation. Folkloric interpretations of the murders suggest that by aggressively removing and possessing the womb, the killer was attempting a perverted alchemical feat, seizing the primordial creative life force of the female victims to achieve personal, dark, spiritual transcendence. Similarly, within occult anatomy, the kidneys, traditionally viewed as the seat of human emotion, desire, and physical vitality, to harvest these organs under the nightly sky was, in the realm of black magic folklore, an act of ritual ingestion or containment, stealing the victim's intrinsic spiritual energy to fuel the practitioner's own esoteric power. The timing of the murders also follows occult patterns. The killings occurred primarily on weekends, several happening around significant dates in the esoteric calendar. The full moon of September 1888, for instance, saw the double murder of Stride and Eddowes, suggesting lunar influences on the ritual timing. The victims themselves may have been chosen for specific reasons beyond mere availability. All were women of the streets. Some researchers suggest they might have been selected based on physical characteristics, names, or even birth dates that fit the ritual requirements. The removal of specific organs, uterus, kidneys, heart, points to a complex magical system where each body part served a particular symbolic or functional purpose in the ritual. What makes the occult theory particularly compelling is how it accounts for the sudden cessation of the murders. It just stopped. If the Ripper was conducting a ritual with specific objectives, once those objectives were achieved, whether the opening of a portal, the channeling of certain energies, or the accomplishment of some magical working, the killings would naturally stop, having served their purpose. The Freemasonic, Theosophical, and Golden Dawn connections that run through this theory reflect the rich occult landscape of Victorian London. The 1880s saw a tremendous revival of interest in esotericism, with secret societies flourishing and magical knowledge becoming more accessible to those with the right connections, usually lots of money and, the right upbringing, etc. In this environment, it's entirely plausible that someone with sufficient knowledge and motivation might have attempted a magical working of unprecedented scale, using the city itself as an altar and its inhabitants as ritual components. Following the horrific finality of the Miller's Court slaughter in November of 1888, the hypersigil was complete, and the operational entity, known as Jack the Ripper, vanished into the London fog. For Rosalind de Onston, the post-Ripper years became a strange, drifting twilight that mirrored the very twilight zone of the occult reality he'd supposedly engineered. Having successfully used the press to broadcast his dark egregore to the masses, Stevenson didn't flee the country or face a dramatic police arrest. Instead, he slipped quietly back into the margins of the British esoteric underground, moving like a ghost through the very secret societies that define the era, almost as if he'd achieved some sort of invisibility. In the immediate aftermath of the killings, Stevenson remained deeply embedded within high-level occult circles. By 1890, he was actively publishing esoteric treatises in Madame Blavatsky's prestigious theosophical journal, Lucifer, showcasing a formidable and unsettling command of ritualistic theory. It was during this period that his paths crossed with some of the most notorious figures of the late Victorian magical revival. He maintained a volatile, intense relationship with Mabel Collins, a prominent theosophist, and famously engaged in a bitter spiritual rivalry with the legendary magician Aleister Crowley. Crowley, who was deeply familiar with the whispered rumors circulating through London's occult underbelly, openly wrote about Stevenson in his later journals, acknowledging de Onston's profound medical dexterity and explicitly naming him as a prime, highly capable suspect for the Whitechapel atrocities. As the 1890s progressed, however, the intense psychic toll of the ritual, or perhaps the crushing weight of the dark forces he'd anchored to his own consciousness, began to visibly fracture Stevenson's physical reality. He increasingly succumbed to severe alcoholism and deepening paranoia, frequently checking himself into various nursing homes and hospitals under assumed names, as if permanently trying to hide from the very phantom he had brought into the world. By the turn of the century, the brilliant narcissistic polymath who had once dictated the public narrative of the murders had largely faded into obscurity. The final chapter of de Onston's life is shrouded in the exact kind of mystery befitting a master of urban occultism. Sometime around 1904, Rosalind de Onston completely vanished from the official British grid. There are no definitive public records of his death, no marked grave bearing his name, and no final hospital admission under his known pseudonyms. This total evaporation from history aligns flawlessly with a deeply unsettling aspect of high-level hermetic magic. Occultists of the era, most notably Crowley, who possessed an intimate understanding of the case's esoteric undercurrents, frequently speculated that one of the ultimate hidden objectives of this specific mega-ritual was the literal and metaphorical achievement of, quote-unquote, invisibility. Far from a mere parlor trick, this form of sorcery meant cloaking oneself so thoroughly within the fabric of reality that you could walk amongst humanity completely unseen, untouchable by the law, and erase from the ledger of history. But from what we do know of how his life settled out in the end, sounds very much like a case of be careful what you wish for. If this was the true intent of the hypersigil, then D'Aunston, assuming he was the Ripper, didn't merely escape justice, he successfully executed the spell. By scrubbing his physical footprint entirely from the earth while his dark creation lived on, he achieved total, permanent concealment. In the grand, terrifying framework of the mega-ritual theory, this fading into nothingness was the ultimate proof of concept, having completely fused his mortal self with the immortal global thought form of the Ripper. The man himself had no further need for a physical identity. He vanished into the fog he had weaponized, leaving behind a blank space where a human life once stood, having successfully become invisible to the world while remaining forever enshrined as an anonymous homicidal ghost, haunting the eternal clockworks of the vast global historical zeitgeist. To understand how these theories gain traction, we need to immerse ourselves in the occult landscape of Victorian London. The 1880s were a time of tremendous spiritual growth and exploration, when the boundaries between science and magic, reason and superstition were becoming increasingly permeable. The Society for Psychical Research, or SPR, had been founded in 1882, bringing together respected scientists, intellectuals, and spiritualists to investigate paranormal phenomena. Members include some of the most brilliant minds of the era, all searching for evidence of life after death, psychic abilities, and other dimensions of reality. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, perhaps the most influential magical society of the period, was established in 1888, the very year of the Ripper murders. Odd. Its members would go on to become some of the most important figures in Western occultism, including Crowley, who joined in 1898. Theosophy, founded by Helena Blavatsky, was gaining followers with its synthesis of Eastern mysticism and Western esotericism. Spiritualist circles were flourishing, with mediums claiming to contact the dead and psychic detectives offering their services to Scotland Yard. In this atmosphere, it's hardly surprising that the Whitechapel murders attracted occult interpretations. The public, press, and even senior police officials were captivated by supernatural explanations for the crimes. Spiritualists, mediums, psychic detectives, and fortune tellers flocked to Whitechapel, hoping to catch the killer through visions or scrying. The newspapers of the day sensationalized the murders, playing up their mysterious and seemingly supernatural elements. The Whitechapel murders became a Gothic fantasy for a society obsessed with prophecy, ritual, and the notion that evil could be explained or exorcised through mystical means. The social melodrama of the era cannot be overstated. Victorian England was a society of extreme contrast. Immense wealth alongside desperate poverty. Scientific advancement alongside deep superstition. Moral propriety alongside hidden hypocrisy and vice. Why is this? I don't know. Probably nothing. Pardon me. The Ripper murders tapped into these tensions, embodying the fears of a society in transition. The press coverage of the murders created a feedback loop of speculation and sensationalism. Each new theory, whether plausible or outlandish, was reported alongside the others, creating a complex tapestry of possibilities that blurred the line between fact and fiction. The public consumed these stories eagerly, and the murders became a form of entertainment as much as a source of terror. This atmosphere of occult revival and social upheaval provided the perfect backdrop for theories of ritual murder and supernatural conspiracy. In a society where seances were fashionable and drawing rooms and scientific inquiry coexisted with spiritual practices, the idea that a killer might be performing magical workings across the city seemed not just possible, but plausible. While the press, the public, and modern esoteric theorists have remained utterly consumed by the geometry of the Whitechapel murders, a completely different, remarkably clinical killer was active in London at the exact same time. This killer's work was so thoroughly overshadowed by the Ripper Panic that it remains one of the great lost anomalies of Victorian crime history. Operating before, during, and after Jack the Ripper's 1888 campaign, this unidentified entity utilized an entirely different and arguably more structured methodology. While the Ripper's crimes were defined by frantic, street-level, throat-slashing, and immediate evisceration, the torso killer worked in absolute privacy, systematically dismantling bodies with surgical expertise before scattering the remains across London's waterways and landmark architecture. The core events of this Shadow series began with the Raynham mystery of May and June 1887, when a female torso and limbs were found packed inside a sack floating in the River Thames, though the head was never recovered. This established a terrifying parallel timeline that directly intersected with the Ripper's canonical streak the following year during the infamous Whitehall mystery of September and October 1888. The pattern continued well after Whitechapel grew quiet. In June 1889, the dismembered parts of a pregnant victim named Elizabeth Jackson were found floating at various points along the river, stretching all the way from Battersea to Horsley Down. The killer delivered a final brazen challenge in September 1889 with the discovery of the Pinchin Street torso. By dumping a headless, legless torso directly within the boundaries of Whitechapel, the killer effectively mocked the entire apparatus of the Ripper investigation. The most provocative escalation of this parallel killer occurred in the very midst of the Ripper's peak activity. On October 2nd, 1888, just 2 days after Jack the Ripper executed the double event by killing Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, the decomposed torso of an unidentified woman was found wrapped in cloth inside a recess of a building under construction. That building was the Norman Shaw Buildings, which was actively being constructed to serve as the brand new ultra-secure headquarters for London's police force, New Scotland Yard. Booyah! Sorry. While the Ripper relied on street-level chaos in the public alleys of Whitechapel to cause frenzied immediate bleeding, the torso killer operated in a closed-door controlled space, favoring a bloodless post-mortem distribution of remains at the very heart of state security. To complete the geometry of this specific dump site, the victim's severed right arm had been fished out of the Thames in Pimlico weeks earlier on September 11th. Connection? And her leg was subsequently found buried near the Scotland Yard construction site on October 17th. While the Metropolitan Police were running blindly through the dark alleys of Whitechapel looking for Robert D'Onston Stevenson or a street prowler or whoever it was, another entity had successfully breached the perimeter of the police's own unfinished fortress to deposit a precisely dissected human torso. If theorists view Jack the Ripper's mutilations as a frantic scramble for localized metaphysical components like the wombs and kidneys, the torso killer's actions read like a highly disciplined cosmological deconstruction. Police surgeon Dr. Thomas Bond, the very same man who performed the autopsy on the final canonical Ripper victim, Mary Jane Kelly, which I couldn't... examined the Whitehall torso and the subsequent 1889 remains of Elizabeth Jackson, noting a distinct divergence from the Whitechapel crimes. The limbs weren't hacked or torn from the sockets. They were cleanly taken apart at the joints by someone who thoroughly understood musculoskeletal anatomy. Furthermore, in every single case in the series, the head was completely removed and never, ever, to this day, recovered. In the realm of late Victorian esoteric folklore and necromancy, the complete removal and withholding of the head carries profound spiritual intent. While the Ripper targeted internal abdominal organs to seize the generative matrix. The torso killer's systematic decapitation and water disposal methods align heavily with classical myths of ritual dismemberment and dispersal, most notably the Egyptian myth of Osiris. All things Egyptian being both beyond popular whilst also rife with an intense, inherent catalyzing effect upon the esoteric imagination of the time. By separating the head, the seat of consciousness, identity, and the ego, from the torso and casting the remains into running water like the Thames, the ritualistic implication shifts from accumulation to eternal binding. In folk magic, a body dispersed in living water can't be spiritually reconstituted. This effectively traps the victim's spirit in a fragmented state, preventing them from seeking post-mortem vengeance against the practitioner or revealing the killer's identity through spiritual mediums. Despite the terrifying scale of these crimes, the torso killer was never caught, and the public largely forgot the cases because they failed to satisfy the media requirements of the late Victorian sensationalist press. Unlike Jack the Ripper, the torso killer never sent taunting letters to the Central News Agency, meaning there was no theatrical pseudonym to capture the public imagination or sell sensationalist newspapers. Additionally, the torso cases presented a slower, more gothic style of horror. Discovering a wrapped bundle that had been floating in the river for a week felt like a grim, static forensic puzzle rather than the active, immediate threat of a midnight predator waiting in the fog. Ultimately, the torso killer utilized the mass hysteria surrounding the Whitechapel murders as a perfect cloak. While the entire police force and the citizen-led Whitechapel Vigilance Committee focused their eyes on the ground, scanning the streets for a man with a Gladstone bag, a doctor's bag, London's waterways were quietly being used to map out a completely different, highly methodical campaign of cold, calculated violence. To fully explore the esoteric landscape of late Victorian London, one must consider a radical alternative to standard Ripper-centric narratives. It's entirely possible that the public hysteria surrounding the Whitechapel murders was merely a carefully engineered diversion, a theatrical outer mystery meant to capture the eyes of the uninitiated and the press, while a far more profound, silent, and structurally advanced magical operation was being executed along the banks of the River Thames. In this speculative framework, Jack the Ripper was the loud, chaotic, exoteric broadcast, while the Thames torso killer was the silent, sublime, esoteric truth. Sizzle versus steak, if I want to get really, inappropriate about it, I guess. The Ripper targeted the visceral, generating a massive psychic harvest of fear through public panic. But the torso killer targeted the structural, systematically dismantling the human form to map out a grand, underlying occult cosmology that sought to bindingly reenact ancient foundational myths at the very heart of the British Empire. The primary identities of the torso killer's victims, where forensic science and local lore have managed to recover them, offer a striking departure from the social profile of the Whitechapel victims and hint at a more selective, ritualistic targeting process. In the case of the June 1889 discovery, the victim was identified as Elizabeth Jackson, a young, unwed, pregnant woman from Chelsea, whose life was defined by transient vulnerability. Unlike the older, chronically destitute street workers of Whitechapel, Jackson represented a specific archetypal purity in the eyes of esoteric thought, the maternal vessel, carrying unborn life within her. Similarly, while the 1887 Raynham victim and the 1888 Whitehall victim were never legally identified, contemporary forensic examinations noted that they were well-nourished women with soft hands that showed no signs of hard manual labor, suggesting that they may have been domestic servants, artist models, or women of a slightly higher social station who vanished into privacy rather than the public streets. To an occult practitioner, these women weren't random targets of opportunity, but specific, purified conduits chosen to represent distinct celestial or earthly principles within a grand sacrificial design. The cosmology behind the torso murders shifts the magical paradigm from the localized elemental accumulation of the Ripper to a massive cosmic act of dismemberment and dispersal that mirrors the primordial creation myths of antiquity. In high society esoteric circles of the late 19th century, the supreme alchemical act was often seen as the replication of the cosmic fracturing, the tearing apart of the primeval deity, such as the Egyptian Osiris or the Vedic Purusha, whose scattered body parts literally become the geography of the created world. By systematically decapitating these women, cleanly disarticulating their limbs at the musculoskeletal joints, and casting the pieces into the living tidal current of the River Thames, the torso killer wasn't merely disposing of evidence. He was performing a literal fluid dispersal of life force energy. The Thames, functioning as the ancient watery spine of London, acted as a massive elemental amplifier, casting the severed components of the maternal vessel, Elizabeth Jackson, into the flowing artery, allowed her fragmented essence to wash past the entire length of the city, effectively baptizing the metropolis in a continuous subterranean stream of sacrificial blood. The ultimate realization of this grand architecture achieved its zenith when the killer transitioned from the fluid movement of the river to the static, unyielding stone of the state, depositing the headless, right armless torso of the Whitehall victim inside the secure, rising vault of New Scotland Yard on October 2nd, 1888, was the definitive anchoring of this cosmological grid. While the Ripper was busy drawing temporary geometric lines on the dirty cobblestones of Whitechapel, the torso killer was literally embedding a sacred, sacrificial foundation stone into the very fortress of imperial law and order. The right arm had already been cast into the waters at Pimlico, and the left leg would soon be buried in the earth nearby, creating a tripartite axis of water, stone, and soil that converged directly beneath the police headquarters. Through this calculated alignment, the practitioner achieved a permanent adversarial binding of the state's protective forces. By placing a monument of ritual dismemberment at the core of Scotland Yard, the killer ensured that the premier institution of Victorian authority was structurally and spiritually erected upon a hidden necromantic shrine, permanently trapping the consciousness of the city within a larger invisible vortex of dark spiritual transcendence. Historically, the Thames torso killer remains one of the most frustratingly elusive phantoms in true crime history, because unlike the frenzied street-level investigations surrounding the Ripper, the Metropolitan Police never formally named a single public suspect during the peak of the murders. The investigation was severely hindered by the fact that the killer worked in absolute privacy, left no fingerprints or paper trail, and completely severed the heads of the victims, making formal identification next to impossible for 3 out of the 4 canonical cases. This absolute lack of face or identity forced contemporary detectives to focus entirely on occupational profiles rather than specific individuals, operating under the baseline assumption that the killer had to be a medical professional, an advanced vivisectionist who prepared anatomical specimens, or a highly skilled butcher. Because London was saturated with medical students and slaughterhouse workers, the police were essentially looking for a needle in a haystack of qualified cleavers and scalpels. In recent years, however, modern historical research has finally broken the century-long silence by introducing the first viable named suspect for the torso murders, split between 2 entirely different theories of the crime. The first major breakthrough came from researcher and author Sarah Bax Horton, who put forward a compelling local candidate named James Crick. Crick was a veteran Thames waterman and lighterman, a worker who operated the heavy barges that navigated the river's complex tidal currents. Horton's thesis argues that Crick possessed the perfect intimate knowledge of the river's hydrodynamics necessary to understand exactly how, when, and where a floating bundle of human remains would drift or wash ashore. Furthermore, as someone deeply embedded in the maritime underbelly of the London docks, he had unrestricted night access to the waterways and secluded shorelines, allowing him to transport heavy, dismembered cargo across the city completely undetected by land-based police patrols. The alternative model school of thought completely bypasses the idea of a separate river-bound predator and instead points the finger directly back at the Whitechapel district, suggesting a terrifying crossover suspect who was responsible for both the Ripper and Torso campaigns. This theory argues that the traditional division between these two series of murders was a failure of Victorian police imagination, and that a single, highly adaptable mad doctor, quote-unquote, was operating across both environments. In this unified framework, the prime suspect is often identified as Severin Klosowski, better known as George Chapman, a trained Polish surgeon who emigrated to Whitechapel shortly before the 1888 terror began, and was later convicted and hanged as a notorious serial poisoner. Proponents of the crossover theory argue that Klosowski possessed the advanced surgical articulation noted by Dr. Thomas Bond on the Torso victims, and that he used the frantic public mutilations of the Ripper persona as an experimental playground, while using the silent, decapitated dispersal of the Torso murders to execute a more controlled, long-term campaign of violence that allowed him to move seamlessly between the land and the water. Let's look at one more ritualistic murderer before we get into even deeper weird. This is just to give us a better base understanding of how ritualized murder was viewed. Ritualistic crime and violence were sort of viewed and thought about at the time. The global press fixation on the Whitechapel murders of 1888 effectively blinded the Western world to parallel ritualistic atrocities occurring elsewhere, most notably the horrific campaign of Joseph Vacher, who would later be dubbed the French Ripper or the Killer of Little Shepherds. I think the second one is much more terrifying. Operating largely between 1894 and 1897, Vacher wandered the isolated French countryside, brutally slaughtering and mutilating at least 11 victims, though contemporary criminologists suspected his true body count exceeded 30. While his active streak peaked slightly after the Autumn of Terror in London, Vacher's formative years and the psychological development of his crimes directly mirrored the cultural and esoteric anxieties of the late 1880s, entirely escaping international notice while the media remained obsessed with the phantom of Whitechapel. In both theory and practice, Vacher's crimes bore a striking, almost telepathic resemblance to the ritualistic frameworks modern theorists attribute to Jack the Ripper. Vacher didn't simply kill, he engaged in a highly specific, repetitive anatomical liturgy. His methodology involved slashing the throats of young shepherdesses and adolescent farm workers before performing extensive post-mortem abdominal mutilations that frequently included the gouging and removal of their internal organs. Furthermore, Vacher's defense and personal writings heavily invoked a twisted, self-styled religious mission. He's one of those guys. He adamantly claimed to be an agent of divine vengeance, driven by divine moments of frenzy sent directly by God to cleanse the land through blood. He even claimed that his thirst for slaughter was a form of spiritual communion, alleging that he drank the blood of his victims to internalize their vital essence, a classic transmutational motif found in the darkest corners of European folk necromancy and primitive acts of shamanic mutilation, vampirism, and anthropophagy, or cannibalism, if you want to take all the pomp and circumstance out of it. The reason Vacher managed to operate in the shadows for so long points to a geographic inversion of the Ripper Panic. While London law enforcement struggled to contain a killer acting within a hyper-concentrated single square mile urban labyrinth, Vacher utilized a vast, unpredictable nomadic orbit, never striking the same province twice in rapid succession. Because late 19th century European police departments rarely shared cross-jurisdictional data, the localized authorities treated each brutally eviscerated corpse as an isolated domestic incident. It wasn't until pioneering criminologist Dr. Alexandre Lacassagne, I think that's how you say it, applied the, barring the extra silliness I put on it, applied the newly emerging principles of criminal profiling, bloodstain analysis, and centralized forensic tracking that the French state realized in a single roaming perpetrator was systematically mapping a trail of blood across the nation. By the time Vacher was finally apprehended and sent to the guillotine in 1898, he had proven that while the world was looking for a monster hidden in the dense London smog, an equally ritualistic nomadic counterpart had successfully used that global distraction to execute a continent-wide slaughter. Following the execution of Joseph Vacher and the unresolved horrors of the Thames Torso murder, late 19th century society found itself deeply destabilized by the sudden theatrical emergence of serial slaughter. For the late Victorian public and the emerging field of criminology, these crimes didn't merely represent a breakdown in public safety. They forced a terrifying confrontation with the deeply embedded cultural anxieties regarding ritualistic murder. At the time, the popular collective imagination was highly susceptible to dark, supernatural, and conspiratorial explanations. Why is this ringing so many bells? Largely because the sheer ferocity of the mutilations seemed to transcend standard criminal motives like robbery or domestic passion. This preoccupation with ritualism was heavily fueled by the sensationalized press, which routinely borrowed language from Gothic horror and esoteric lore to describe the crime scenes, subtly conditioning the public to look past the actions of a lone, material predator and instead seek out a grand, hidden hand guiding the blade. This frantic quest for a framework to explain the seemingly inexplicable was further complicated by the birth of modern sexology. Just 2 years prior to the Autumn of Terror in 1886, the Austro-German psychiatrist Dr. Richard von Krafft-Ebing published his foundational medico-forensic study, Psychopathia Sexualis. At the time of the murders, this text was strictly in the domain of highly specialized fields, alienists, forensic pathologists, and jurists, and was intentionally written with key passages heavily masked in clinical Latin to prevent it from, quote-unquote, corrupting the general reading public. Good call. In its clinical passages, Krafft-Ebing formally defined the concept of lustmord, or lust murder, detailing a terrifying psychological pathology where sex and extreme, mutilating aggression became completely fused. He posited that for a certain class of psychopathic offender, the chaotic dismantling of a human body, the extraction of organs, and the shedding of blood were not acts of spiritual sorcery, but a deeply personalized, eroticized ritual, quote-unquote ritual, required to achieve sexual gratification. However, because the mass culture at large had absolutely no awareness of these emerging psychiatric concepts, a profound intellectual vacuum formed. The average citizen lacked the psychological vocabulary to comprehend a predator driven entirely by internalized deviant sexual sadism. To the Victorian mind, a crime without a material motive like robbery had to possess an external ideological purpose. Consequently, rather than interpreting the surgical, repetitive nature of the Whitechapel or torso mutilations through the lens of a clinical lustmord, the public imagination instinctively defaulted to the only framework it understood: ancient, supernatural, and conspiratorial folklore. This obsession with ritualism inevitably collided with the intense socio-political and religious friction fracturing Europe at the turn of the century. When investigators and the public looked for a framework to explain these seemingly calculated, blood-soaked atrocities, they frequently weaponized ancient, toxic prejudices. The most immediate manifestation of this was a widespread revival of blood libel, the centuries-old anti-Semitic conspiracy theory alleging that marginalized groups engaged in ritualistic murder for occult or religious purposes. This dark undercurrent was already operating at a fever pitch within the popular consciousness, famously exploding into the Ripper investigation itself via the discovery of the infamous Goulston Street graffito, which cryptically declared that, quote, "The Jewes, J-U-W-E-S, are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," unquote. Rather than viewing the text as a chaotic piece of street graffiti or a crude attempt to shift blame, contemporary commentators immediately seized upon it as proof of a vast insular and ritually precise conspiracy operating under the cover of the East End slums. Simultaneously, the atmospheric dread regarding ritualistic violence began to intersect with a broader deeply complex shift in geopolitical and religious thought. The late 1880s and 1890s marked the early foundational stirrings of modern ideological movements centered around the Holy Land, where literalist interpretations of biblical prophecy were beginning to gain traction among certain elite circles. Within these fringe apocalyptic frameworks, the concepts of a multi-stage, blood-consecrated ritual was occasionally whispered about, not merely as an act of localized black magic, but as a dark, catalytic prerequisite required to shift the geopolitical reality grid toward a grander, prophetic finale. And while the public and the tabloid media focused their terror on the immediate threat of blood libel and street-level sorcery, a tiny cadre of deep-level theorists began to suspect that the geometric precision of these urban slaughters was secretly tied to an overarching transnational design, one meant to violently realign the spiritual geography of the West to pave the way for an ultimate apocalyptic restoration. Before we explore the more mind-bending theories concerning Lewis Carroll and the fourth dimension, we need to examine a fascinating and deeply unsettling connection between Jack the Ripper, the investigation of Jack the Ripper, and one of the most symbolically charged locations in biblical tradition, Mount Hermon. This connection centers on Sir Charles Warren, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner who led the Ripper investigation and his earlier monumental archaeological work in Palestine. In 1869, nearly 2 decades before the Whitechapel murders, Sir Charles Warren conducted a meticulous survey of Mount Hermon on behalf of the British Empire's Palestine Exploration Fund. This ancient mountain range holds profound, terrifying significance within the Enochic traditions, different from Enochian. Enochian is the magical system. Enochic is more to do with the Book of Enoch. So, just saying. According to the apocryphal Book of Enoch, Mount Hermon was the exact terrestrial coordinates where 200 heavenly beings known as the Watchers, egregores, Grigori, awakened ones, etc., descended to the earth during the days of Jared. These Watchers violated their cosmic mandate by taking human wives and fathering the Nephilim, mighty monstrous giants who corrupted humanity by teaching them forbidden arts such as metallurgy, cosmetics, sorcery, and the shedding of blood. Most of that stuff has really helped us out a lot, so thanks, I guess. Not so much for the shedding blood part. And it's not like we weren't shedding blood already before these guys showed up. So the story doesn't quite pan out all the way. Anyways, the Book of Enoch specifically states, quote, "And they were in all 200 who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon, and they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it." Unquote. So you see, it's because of the imprecations. I'm sorry. Okay. This descent of the subsequent infection of human consciousness represents the ultimate rebellion in Near Eastern mythology, permanently establishing Mount Hermon as a volatile interdimensional nexus point, where the boundary between the divine and the mundane was violently torn open. During his high-altitude survey, Warren scaled the peak to discover Qasr Entar, the highest temple of the ancient world, sitting at an astonishing 9,232 feet above sea level. Perched on a massive oval stone plateau, Warren unreeled his measuring lines around the roofless, rectangular building made of cyclopean-hewn stone blocks. More significantly, he discovered a fragmentary limestone stela. Stele? Is it steel? Let's go with steel. He discovered a fragmentary limestone stele bearing a Greek inscription that subsequent scholars like George Nicholsberg directly connected back to the Enochic Angel Rebellion. The translation reads, quote, "According to the command of the greatest and holy God, those who take an oath proceed from here." Unquote. Now, while Orthodox scholars interpret this as a standard ancient invocation to a localized deity like Baal Hermon, Esoteric researchers offer a far more sinister reading. They argue the artifact is a tangible, physical record of the Watcher's mutual curse, a cosmic monument documenting an open rebellion against divine authority. Following its discovery, Warren broke the ancient inscription into two pieces so it was easier to carry, and hauled it down the mountain to ship back to London. That's the story. That's why he broke it, so it was easier to carry. It is big. I mean, I don't know. But anyways, way to go, archaeologist. Intriguingly, this artifact was quietly absorbed into the deep subterranean archives of the British Museum, hidden away from public view for over a century, as if the institutional gatekeepers of the empire recognized the volatile metaphysical frequency it possessed. According to parapolitical researcher Matthew Arrett, this connection becomes exponentially more complex when we examine the precise administrative architecture of the Home Office during the 1888 Autumn of Terror. Warren wasn't a lone eccentric who happened to stumble out of the Syrian desert and into the Scotland Yard Commissioner's office. He operated at the dead center of a highly specialized cadre of imperial administrators deeply obsessed with biblical prophecy, sacred geography, and the physical remnants of King Solomon's temple. During the height of the Whitechapel slaughters, Warren's assistant commissioner for crime, the head of the Criminal Investigation Department, CID, was Sir Robert Anderson. Like Warren, Anderson was a high-level intellectual who dedicated his life to the mechanics of biblical archaeology and eschatology. It's the study of the big thing at the end, when everything goes bad. Eventually publishing heavy theological volumes on the Book of Daniel and the literal timelines of the end times. The presence of the two most powerful law enforcement officials in the British Empire, both possessing unparalleled expertise in the specific regions and texts associated with the Watcher's descent, raises sharp questions about the true hidden dimensions of the investigation. Arrett's research suggests this administrative alignment was anything but accidental. From an esoteric parapolitical perspective, the Whitechapel murders can be viewed as an attempt to replicate or violently reactivate that ancient transmission of forbidden knowledge that occurred on Mount Hermon, effectively constructing an artificial urban proxy of the mountain portal right in the heart of London. If the original descent of the Watchers brought celestial secrets to humanity via a rebellion against cosmic law, the Ripper slaughters acted as a dark mirror, a hyper-calculated ritual transmission of infernal, reality-altering knowledge fueled by raw violence and the systematic shedding of human blood. This geopolitical lens reveals how deeply the crimes may have intersected with the early atmospheric stirrings of Christian Zionism and British Israelism, movements popular among the late Victorian elite that sought to manipulate real-world geography to fulfill apocalyptic scripture. Technically, these guys are still around, but I'm not going to get into it. Anyways, within this paradigm, the geometric patterns of the Whitechapel killings, which some researchers argue formed a terrestrial map of specific celestial alignments, were meant to serve as metaphysical foundations. Each murder site functioned as an anchored node, a localized high place, quote-unquote high place, consecrated by blood, intended to shift the spiritual frequency of the British capital to align with the grander, transnational, and prophetic design. This theory of institutional orchestration deepens significantly when we examine the bizarre tangled web of the aforementioned Quatuor Coronati Lodge, number 2076. Consecrated in London in early 1886, Quatuor Coronati was established under the United Grand Lodge of England as the world's very first premier Masonic research lodge, explicitly designed to study Masonic antiquities and sacred architecture. Its founding master-elect? None other than Sir Charles Warren himself. The lodge's rosters and innermost circles were populated by the exact antiquarians, police officials, and institutional figures who oversaw the subsequent Ripper investigations and medical autopsies. This heavy concentration of specialized Masonic scholars handling the case has led fringe theorists to suggest that the apparent incompetence, quote-unquote incompetence, of the police was actually a highly coordinated exercise in containment. This administrative containment became explosive on the night of September 30th, 1888, during the double event. Following the murder of Catherine Eddowes, a chalked inscription was discovered on a brick wall in Goulston Street, reading, once again, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," unquote. Sir Charles Warren rushed to the scene personally before dawn and, in an unprecedented and baffling move that even confused his own detectives, ordered the message instantly scrubbed from the wall before it could be photographed or properly analyzed. Now, while history records this as a panicked attempt to prevent anti-Semitic riots in the volatile East End, the esoteric narrative suggests a far more manipulative double game. By deliberately introducing the archaic, highly debated spelling of Jewes, J-U-W-E-S, which certain fringe Masonic exposés link to the traditional names of the three flawed builders in Hiram Abiff's death ritual, Jubello, I don't remember Jubello is one of them, but the three guys who killed Hiram Abiff, the perpetrators effectively threw a massive, weaponized red herring into the public consciousness. This calculated ambiguity allowed the architects of the narrative to play both sides of a powerful psychological operations coin. On one hand, it seeded the public mind with a dark, ritualistic conspiracy preying on the era's intense, systemic anti-Semitism. A toxic fixation that mirrors the modern-day true crime obsession with desperately trying to pin the murders on a localized scapegoat, such as a Polish Jewish immigrant, while on the other hand, it completely cloaked the true elite practitioners behind a wall of manufactured chaos, reducing a high-level geopolitical and occult operation down to the level of common ethnic friction. This pervasive atmosphere of institutional suppression extended even to the literary giants of the era. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, an interesting character to say the least, the creator of the world's ultimate rationalist detective, Sherlock Holmes, remained uncharacteristically reticent when presented by the public to chime in on how his fictional counterpart would solve the Whitechapel horrors. Doyle's curious reluctance to deeply engage with the case, or to let Holmes outsmart the real-world killer on the printed page while the panic was fresh, suggests that even contemporary intellectuals recognized that the forces operating in Whitechapel were tied to an institutional grid far too dangerous to casually expose to popular fiction. If Warren was indeed intimately familiar with the traditions surrounding Mount Hermon, the Watchers, and the strict geometric laws of Solomon's Temple, he would have instantly recognized the ritual architecture stamped onto the blood-soaked alleys of Whitechapel. His systemic destruction of evidence, his constant clashes with the Home Secretary, and his sudden resignation on the very day Mary Jane Kelly's thoroughly dissected body was discovered inside Miller's Court can be reinterpreted not as bureaucratic failure, but perhaps as a calculated withdrawal. The Mount Hermon connection ultimately reveals a terrifying thesis regarding the relationship between physical geography and human consciousness. If certain ancient locations serve as natural interdimensional nexus points, hijacking those specific frequencies usually requires arduous pilgrimage to remote, high-altitude sanctuaries like Qasr Antar. The Ripper mega ritual, however, was designed to bypass geography entirely through an act of violent transmutation. By using the dense industrial working-class population of the East End as raw ritual components, the architects successfully replicated the Hermon frequency within the urban grid of London, building a blood-consecrated altar in the heart of empire and anchoring the forbidden chaotic wisdom of the fallen Watchers directly into the bloodstream of the modern world. To fully understand why the founding master of the world's premier Masonic research lodge was running the Metropolitan Police during the Autumn of Terror, one must look below the surface of the earth, specifically beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The underlying motive that unites Sir Charles Warren, the Palestine Exploration Fund, or PEF, and the ritualistic butchery in Whitechapel is rooted in an obsessive imperial obsession with the reconstruction of the Third Temple. Ugh. Sorry. Like I said earlier, these guys are still around, just in a different form and fashion. Between 1867 and 1870, nearly 2 decades before the Ripper murders, Warren was tasked by the British elite to map the literal material footprint of King Solomon's temple. Because Ottoman authorities strictly forbade digging directly on the sacred plateau of the noble sanctuary, the Temple Mount, Warren and his royal engineers performed an astonishing feat of clandestine engineering. They sank deep vertical shafts outside the perimeter walls and tunneled horizontally through mountains of ancient debris, physically touching and measuring the colossal cyclopean foundational stones laid by Herod the Great. Essentially, it's, "Hey Solomon, I drink your milkshake." Through these dangerous subterranean excavations, including the discovery of the ancient water system now known as Warren's Shaft, Warren wasn't merely conducting historical research. He was creating a precise mathematical blueprint of the ultimate nexus point of Western eschatology. To the late Victorian elite, heavily steeped in British Israelism and an early aggressive strain of geopolitical Christian Zionism, the physical reconstruction of the Third Temple was viewed as a literal mechanical trigger. It was an absolute requirement to initiate the biblical end times, activate the Battle of Armageddon, and cement a divinely ordained eternal global empire. Within the grandest and most sinister iterations of the mega-ritual theory, the Whitechapel murders represented an act of displaced geomancy. Because the British Empire could not yet physically clear the Dome of the Rock from the Temple Mount to lay a physical cornerstone, high-level operators allegedly used the urban layout of London, the throbbing heart of global finance and power, as a proxy canvas. By plotting the slaughters in rigid geometric configurations that mirrored the layout and proportions of Solomon's temple, and by consecrating those nodes with rapid-fire surgical blood sacrifice, the perpetrators were constructing a metaphysical blueprint. It was a thought-form temple, erected in the fog of the modern world, designed to violently drag the apocalyptic frequencies of the Holy Land into the material machinery of the British state. This 19th century occult engineering has a direct, terrifyingly active bearing on today's iteration of Third Temple accelerationism. What was once the domain of secret societies, hidden limestone steels in the British Museum, and clandestine tunnels in the 1880s has morphed into a highly visible, multi-million-dollar, high-tech geopolitical movement. Today, organizations like the Temple Institute utilize the exact architectural data gathered by Warren, now augmented by advanced 3D ground-penetrating radar and digital mapping, to prepare for the physical reconstruction of the structure. The model movement operates with a hyperfixation on ritual purity that mirrors the hyperfixation on the Whitechapel grid. A prime example of this modern manifestation is the intense, high-stakes focus on the procurement and breeding of flawless red heifers, an absolute requirement under ancient Levitical law to produce the ashes needed for the ritual purification of the priesthood and the temple bedrock before any construction can begin. When viewed through the lens of Matthew Arrett's parapolitical analysis, the modern Third Temple movement has shed its Victorian Masonic apron but retained its exact operational DNA. It's transformed from a localized occult working into a global, tech-driven psychological operation. The contemporary movement is no longer hidden in the shadows of research lodges like the Quattuor Coronati. It's backed by powerful transnational political action committees, algorithmic social media propaganda, and radical religious accelerationists who view the trigger of an apocalyptic conflict over the Temple Mount as a desirable historical outcome. Just as the perpetrators of the Whitechapel murders used the weaponized Jews, J-U-W-E-S, graffiti to stoke ethnic friction and mask their high-level geopolitical wizardry behind a curtain of East End anti-Semitism, modern prophetic accelerationists routinely manipulate complex religious and ethnic flashpoints on a global scale. The ancient transmission of forbidden knowledge that Warren mapped on Mount Hermon and supposedly anchored into London via the flesh of 5 vulnerable victims is no longer a dormant historical footnote. It's the active driving engine of modern apocalyptic geopolitics. A continuous, century-long hypersigil that began with a knife in the dark of Whitechapel and now positions the world at the literal knife edge of global conflict. That's the big scary part. That's the part that reaches into today. Where are we at? 151? Okay, I'm going to try and get out this last part, and then I'm gonna have to do the addendum part separately. So this is one of the weirdest theories, and I saved the weirdest for last, so I can trick you all into listening to an entire episode. We come to perhaps the most controversial and fascinating theory of all. One that I personally, I took a little bit of liberties with, but everything that I've added onto this does have legitimate standing in the belief systems and ideas floating around in London of this time. So, this is a theory that not only washes away the bad taste of the intense earthly terrors we just navigated, but also transports us directly into the realm of what some might call the acme of oddities, the zenith of creepy weirdness, or yes, perhaps even the absolute apex of high strangeness. What if the mind behind the Whitechapel horrors belonged to none other than Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, better known to global history by his literary pen name, Lewis Carroll? At first glance, this hypothesis sounds entirely absurd. Dodgson was a deeply conservative deacon, an Oxford mathematician, a master of formal logic, and a world-renowned writer of whimsical children's stories, amongst other things we'll get into. He seemed infinitely more at home within the cloistered, pristine halls of Christ Church than navigating the blood-slicked, poverty-stricken stone labyrinths of the East End. Yet when we dismantle his hyper-specific intellectual obsessions, a series of uncanny, deeply unsettling connections begin to crystallize. The goal here isn't necessarily to convince a jury that Dodgson held the blade, but to confront an infinitely more haunting possibility, that Dodgson believed the veil between realities could be mathematically and physically breached, and that he possessed the precise radical geometry to attempt it. So, in not so many words, it doesn't matter what you or I believe. Could it be that he believed it this strongly? So to fully grasp the mechanics of this theory, one must look at the profound intellectual crisis rocking 19th century mathematics. The Victorian era was deeply destabilized by the sudden discovery of non-Euclidean geometry and the theoretical existence of the fourth dimension. For a classical logician like Dodgson, the realization that space could bend, that parallel lines could cross, and that an entire unseen spatial realm could exist perpendicular to our three-dimensional reality wasn't a mere fairy tale fantasy. It was an absolute, terrifying mathematical truth. This spatial anxiety found its ultimate champion in Dodgson's contemporary, the eccentric mathematician Charles Howard Hinton. While academic circles treated higher dimensions as dry coordinate geometry, Hinton went completely over the esoteric edge. In his influential essays like What is the Fourth Dimension, 1884, and A New Era of Thought, Hinton posited that the fourth dimension was a literal other realm, the actual dwelling place of the human soul, a higher plane of consciousness, and a vast unseen territory that populated our world with ghosts, spirits, and gods. Hinton argued that humanity was trapped in a state of primitive space blindness. He famously constructed an elaborate system of multicolored wooden blocks designed to train the human mind to mentally visualize four-dimensional space by meditating on its three-dimensional cross-sections. To Hinton, geometry was a form of meditative magical practice, a deliberate mental gymnastics meant to tear open the third-density brain and allow human consciousness to break through the veil. Crucial to Hinton's hyperspatial theory and the dark linchpin of the Lewis Carroll hypothesis was his revolutionary work on chirality, or handedness. In three-dimensional space, a left-handed object and a right-handed object are asymmetric mirror images of one another. No matter how much you spin or rotate a left shoe in our three dimensions, you can never turn it into a right shoe. They are fundamentally locked in their asymmetric states. However, Hinton demonstrated a staggering mathematical loophole. If you take a three-dimensional asymmetric object, lift it out of the third dimension, rotate it through the perpendicular axis of the fourth dimension, and drop it back down into our world, it will rematerialize completely mirror inverted. A left hand passed through the fourth dimension returns to our reality as a right hand. The object's molecular orientation, its internal structure, and its entire asymmetrical identity are instantly reversed. Within Hinton's framework, a mirror wasn't just a polished piece of glass. It was a physical, two-dimensional cross-section of a four-dimensional rotation. When we look through this dizzying hyperspatial lens, the horrific, anomalous mutilations of the Whitechapel crime scenes take on a mind-bending, ritualistic purpose. For a mad mathematician seeking to validate Hinton's theories, the human body was the ultimate organic canvas of three-dimensional chirality. Our internal biology is strictly asymmetrical. The heart rests on the left, the liver on the right, the spleen nestled opposite. If Dodgson was indeed operating under a severe fugue state obsession with breaching the higher dimensions, his surgical cuts were not acts of blind mutilation, but highly controlled, gruesome experiments in spatial transmutation. He wasn't just dissecting flesh, he was looking for proof of situs inversus, searching the corpses of his victims to see if the organs themselves had successfully undergone a four-dimensional chiral flip. By extracting specific organs and rearranging them in inverted geometric configurations on the cold pavement, the killer was attempting to build a physical biomechanical catalyst. He was trying to construct an organic tesseract out of the victims' bodies, using the sharp trajectory of his blade as a line segment drawn along a four-dimensional axis, desperately trying to force the three-dimensional density of flesh and blood to rotate through Hinton's hidden realm, and violently shattering the looking glass between our universe and the next. In his masterpiece, Through the Looking Glass, Dodgson didn't just write a playful story. He mapped out the literal physics of a mirror-reversed reality. He was deeply preoccupied with what mathematicians call enantiomorphs, objects that are identical in structure but reversed in orientation, like a left hand and a right hand. In a perfectly mirrored universe, everything is inverted. This is precisely where the fringe clinical data of the Whitechapel crime scenes takes on a chilling new resonance. Forensic investigators were repeatedly baffled by the Ripper's highly specific, bizarre treatment of the victim's internal anatomy. In several instances, organs were not merely hacked away. They were systematically extracted through precise, inverted incisions, with certain contemporary researchers pointing out a hyperfixation on the left side of the body. Within the terrifying logic of the looking glass theory, these gruesome dissections weren't acts of random sadism. They were an empirical surgical search for situs inversus, the total internal mirror reversal of organs. Dodgson, driven by an obsessive desire to prove the physical reality of the mirror world, may have been butcher testing these victims, searching for physical anomalies that proved a traveler had crossed over from the other side, or attempting to physically flip the anatomical coordinates of three-dimensional flesh to force it through a spatial looking glass. This mathematical obsession was deeply intertwined with the late Victorian spiritualist revival. Dodgson was an active, documented member of the Society for Psychical Research, or SPR, joining its ranks shortly after its founding in 1882, alongside the era's elite intellectual vanguards, including future Prime Minister Arthur Balfour and physicist Sir William Crookes. He attended intense, closed-door meetings and systematically curated a massive personal library dedicated to SPR journals, telepathic case studies, and spirit manifestations. For Dodgson, spiritualism was not an emotional pastime. It was an experimental science. He approached the seance room with the cold, analytical rigor of an Oxford logician, treating mediums as biological instruments and the spirit world as a tangible parallel space operating under its own hidden laws of physics. Through his active status in the SPR, Dodgson was intimately privy to the raw, unredacted data of the most sensational paranormal investigations of the decade. He closely followed the Society's exhausting, multi-year cross-examination of the Boston medium Leonora Piper, whose uncanny ability to channel hidden, highly personal information from dead communicators left even the most hardened skeptic in the SPR bewildered. Furthermore, Dodgson was deeply fascinated by the SPR's monumental 1886 publication, Phantasms of the Living, a massive analytical cataloging of hundreds of quote-unquote crisis apparitions. Cases where individuals at the exact moment of their sudden violent death or intense trauma projected a visible ghost to their loved ones miles away. To a mind obsessed with the fourth dimension, these terrifying accounts provided empirical proof that extreme human trauma and the sudden tearing away of life force could instantly bypass the physical constraints of three-dimensional space, projecting a localized consciousness across the globe in a fraction of a second. It was within this high-level research ecosystem that Dodgson mastered the mechanics of the psychomantium, a ritual apparatus popularized within esoteric circles by his SPR contemporaries, the crusading journalist and occultist W.T. Stead. Rooted in ancient Greek necromancy and modern scrying theory, a psychomantium was a specially constructed pitch-black chamber featuring a single large mirror tilted at a hyper-precise angle, illuminated by nothing more than the dim, distant glow of a solitary candle. The practice required the initiate to stare into the absolute depth of the reflection for hours in a state of total sensory deprivation. The theoretical mechanism was profoundly psychological yet deeply occult. The dark mirror acted as a visual trap, completely disorienting the three-dimensional brain's visual cortex and inducing a profound state of waking dissociation. As the physical eyes lost their depth perception, the mirror ceased to be a solid object and transformed into a fluid, shifting gateway. For the ordinary SPR researcher, this was an experiment in catching a fleeting glimpse of a dead relative. Before an unhinged, multi-compartmentalized genius like Dodgson, the psychomantium was a literal laboratory for high-level sorcery. He recognized that the dark mirror room was a physical mechanism designed to systematically shatter the observer's ego, dissolving the rigid boundaries of the mortal mind until it was fluid enough to slide through the looking glass, allowing a practitioner to walk right into that perpendicular, four-dimensional realm that Charles Hinton had mapped out on paper. To fully comprehend how deeply the concept of the looking glass saturated the subconscious of Victorian London, one must look past the cutting-edge mathematics of Hinton and the experimental journals of the SPR. The elite, multidimensional theories of the Oxford elite were floating atop a vast, deep ocean of ubiquitous, everyday domestic folklore that treated the household mirror not as a passive piece of home decor, but as a volatile, highly dangerous, metaphysical boundary stone. In the mass culture of the 1880s, the mirror was widely feared as a literal soul trap. This anxiety was most acutely manifested in the rigid, almost universal Victorian customs surrounding death and mourning. The moment a death left a body inside a home, a specific ritual protocol was initiated. Every single reflective surface in the house, from grand parlor mirrors to tiny hand glasses, had to be instantly shrouded in thick, black crepe cloth. The folk belief driving this practice was absolute and terrifying. It dictated that if a newly departed soul caught sight of its own reflection before escaping the house, it would become permanently ensnared within the silvered glass, unable to pass on, transformed into a malevolent, trapped entity. Worse still, if a living family member looked into a mirror in a house where a corpse lay uncovered, they were believed to be looking directly at their own imminent demise, as the mirror was thought to project the looming shadow of death itself. This fear of the mirror as a fragile containment field explains the deep-seated cultural dread regarding breaking a mirror. While modern society flippantly associates it with a generic 7 years of bad luck, the Victorian understanding was far more specific and catastrophic. To shatter a looking glass was to violently rupture an energetic reservoir. It meant fracturing your own reflected astral double, leaving your soul vulnerable to demonic hitchhikers and releasing whatever ancient non-physical entities had been accumulating inside the depth of the glass over decades of household use. Simultaneously, the culture was obsessed with the darker, predictive mechanics of mirror scrying or catoptromancy, particularly among young women. A widely popular Halloween and midsummer folk ritual dictated that if a person sat alone in a pitch-black room at the stroke of midnight, eating an apple while combing their hair by the light of a single candle, the mirror would gradually shift. The reflection would dissolve to reveal the face of their future spouse walking behind them. However, folklore carried a grim warning. If the initiate's timing was off, or if their intent was impure, they would look into the glass only to see a skeleton, a demon, or, most terrifyingly of all, their own doppelganger. The concept of the doppelganger, the exact autonomous spiritual double of a living person, haunted the Victorian literary and psychological landscape. To encounter one's own double walking the streets of London was considered the ultimate omen of death or madness. It represented a severe, catastrophic leak into the fabric of reality, suggesting that the boundary between our universe and the alternate mirror-inverted plane had dangerously broken down. For a mind operating on the extraordinary intellectual frequency of Charles Dodgson, these domestic superstitions were not primitive nonsense. They were the localized, folk-encoded descriptions of real hyperspatial mechanics. Where the common street dweller saw a ghost trap, Dodgson saw a two-dimensional cross-section of a four-dimensional rotation. By superimposing this atmospheric folklore onto the rigid geometry of the Whitechapel killings, the mega-ritual ceases to be an abstract mathematical exercise and becomes a desperate, violent attempt to exploit these exact cultural fears. The killer was treating the fog-covered alleys of the East End as a massive urban looking-glass, consecrating the street corners with blood to act as the silvered backing of a mirror, deliberately trying to force the hidden, repressed doppelganger of his own fractured psyche to break through the spatial boundary, shatter the glass of the mundane world, and manifest in the flesh as a permanent, untraceable god of the fourth dimension. To fully dissect the terrifying psychological landscape of the Lewis Carroll hypothesis, we must venture into the deep, subterranean chambers of Dodgson's fractured mind. In his outward personal life, Dodgson operated within a state of severe, exhausting psychological tension, maintaining a rigid, puritanical facade as an ordained deacon of the Church of England. Yet beneath this starch-collared, pious Oxford exterior lay a profound chasm of emotional suppression, as is usually the case with these types. So it seems just about every time I read the newspaper, which I try not to do, but whatever. Dodgson exhibited a severe, lifelong stammer that miraculously vanished only when he was in the company of young children, and he displayed an intense, documented aversion to adult women, whom he frequently treated with cold detachment, anxiety, or outright hostility. Modern analysts and alternative biographers suggest that this extreme compartmentalization caused his consciousness to undergo a catastrophic split. Under the crushing pressure of his hidden desires and the claustrophobic rules of Oxford society, the looking-glass of his mind may have completely shattered into a severe precursor of dissociative identity disorder. The cold, stuttering mathematics dawn by day was entirely severed from the hyper-rational surgical predator who carved up the urban grid by night. When viewed through the looking-glass of his unconscious mind, this psychological fracture represents the violent unshackling of his repressed shadow self, a deep, dark, monstrous inner entity that he seemingly encoded into his own nonsense poetry as the Jabberwock. Far from a harmless children's monster, the Jabberwock is a creature born of pure primal violence, characterized by jaws that bite and claws that snatch. Within the framework of his internalized psychosis, the famous lines from the poem take on a deeply sinister, confessional resonance. 1, 2, 1, 2, and through. The vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. The rhythmic, repetitive cadence of 1, 2, 1, 2, and through act as a perfect mechanical simulation of a rapid, rhythmic, and frenzied knife attack. The vorpal blade, going snicker-snack, mimics the sound of cold steel parting flesh, while the macabre obsession with severing and taking the head directly mirrors the Whitechapel predator's ritualistic focus on throat-slitting and anatomical extraction. For the fractured Dodgson, the writing of the poem was a leak from his shadow self, a sublimated warning that this internal monster was clawing at the glass, desperate to break free and hunt. This internal conflict curdled into something infinitely darker when examined through the lens of modern reinterpretations of his relationships with young girls, most notably the real-life Alice Liddell. While Victorian Romanticism painted Dodgson as a harmless, whimsical companion to the Liddell children, a contemporary psychological evaluation reveals a highly manipulative, obsessive, and predatory behavioral pattern. His sudden, unexplained falling out with the Liddell family in 1863, which resulted in another massive intentional gap in his personal diaries, strongly suggests that his intense boundary-crossing fixation on the young Alice had finally alarmed her parents, forcing a sudden excommunication. Tee-hee. Dodgson's entire life was spent retreating into a highly curated world of juvenile innocence, a desperate attempt to freeze time and escape the terrifying, mature sexuality of adult women that he so profoundly feared and reviled. This desperate obsession with freezing youth and innocence was the exact driving engine behind his massive, lifelong preoccupation with portrait photography. In the 1860s and 70s, wet plate photography was a laborious, chemical, and almost alchemical process. Dodgson transformed his darkroom into a high-level ritual space. To understand his obsession, one must bridge his mathematical theories with the intense contemporary Victorian folklore surrounding the camera lens. Because just like the household mirror, early photography was widely feared by the public as a literal engine of soul capture. It was universally observed that a photograph stripped a person of their motion, pulling a permanent, unaging double of their physical form out of the stream of time and locking it forever onto a chemical plate. Dodgson was deeply embedded in an SPR research community that was actively investigating the phenomena of spirit photography and thoughtography. The radical belief that an intense, concentrated human mind could project images, phantoms, and psychological projections directly onto photographic emulsions without the use of light. To Dodgson's fractured mind, the camera was a mechanical sibling to the mirror. Taking a photograph was an act of high magic. It was the systematic drawing of an energetic double out of a living subject, trapping their life force in a silver halide suspension. When he was forced to give up photography in 1880, a profound aesthetic and psychological vacuum was torn open within his psyche. He could no longer use the camera lens to safely siphon, capture, and control his obsessive desires. Consequently, when his consciousness finally underwent its ultimate fugue state fracture in 1880, the ritual mechanism simply shifted mediums. He traded the chemical fixing bath of the darkroom for the cold pavement of Whitechapel. He was no longer using a lens to gently freeze the souls of young girls on glass plates. He was using a Vorpal blade to rip the life force out of adult women, using their spilled blood to anchor a permanent four-dimensional image of his monstrous inner Jabberwock, sounds a lot like Jack, into the very architecture of the world, achieving the ultimate terrifying synthesis of mathematical precision, folkloric soul-trapping, and predatory violence. This psychological chasm is backed by a glaring, concrete piece of historical evidence that has frustrated biographers for over a century: the missing diary pages. The private journals of Charles Dodgson during the exact crucial periods of the 1888 Ripper killings were systematically cut out with scissors by his family members after his death. What terrifying confessions, what complex geometric equations, or what midnight timelines of Whitechapel wanderings were inked onto those pages that required their total permanent destruction? Furthermore, Dodgson was an absolute master of wordplay, cryptograms, and complex anagrams. In 1996, researcher Richard Wallace rocked the true crime underground by demonstrating that if you take specific, seemingly innocent passages from Carroll's children's books and rearrange the letters with mathematical precision, they reveal explicit, blood-soaked confessions of the Whitechapel murders. Most famously, theorists suggest that Carroll's ultimate unanswered literary riddle, "Why is a raven like a writing desk?" isn't nonsense at all. It's actually a highly compressed, intricately coded cryptographic key that contains his true identity, his motives, and the location of his altar. If you bring a mirror into the use of some of these cryptographic games and revelries that he might have encoded in his fiction, it takes on an even deeper just significance and complexity. Ultimately, the looking glass theory forces us to confront an entirely new dimension of horror. It demands that we look past the image of a common street thug and instead contemplate the nightmare of a hyper-intelligent mad mathematician using the human body as a biological compass to draw non-Euclidean diagrams upon the pavement of London. For a mind like Dodgson's, conventional paper and ink were fundamentally inadequate to express the higher dimensional laws of the cosmos. The breakthrough could only be achieved by writing his equations in the universal medium of life force and blood. When we plot the Whitechapel murder sites through this mathematical lens, they cease to be mere geographic points and are revealed as the literal drawing lines of a cosmic gateway. In the advanced mechanics of occult philosophy, this brings us directly to the doorstep of the ancient Vesica Piscis, the perfect eye-shaped lens formed by the precise intersection of two equal circles. In mainstream sacred geometry, this shape represents the birth canal of creation, the harmonious blending of the spiritual and material. But in the darker, inverted realms of esoteric sorcery, this geometric intersection represents something infinitely more volatile. It's the ultimate cosmic zipper. The precise anatomical and spatial coordinates where two entirely different dimensions are forced to collide, creating a tear in the fabric of reality through which an initiate can peer out of our known universe and step directly into the unknown. At the absolute heart of the most radical, mind-shattering occult theories surrounding the Whitechapel horrors lies the Vesica Piscis, the overlapping circles that mark the violent structural collision between Universe A, the material ordered cosmos of our daily reality, and Universe B, the shadow inverse, the antimatter realm of the Qliphoth, Typhonian forces, and primal Gnostic abysses. In mainstream sacred geometry, the Vesica Piscis is celebrated as a holy symbol of harmony, the birth canal of creation and the womb of the divine feminine. But within the dark, predatory architecture of left-hand path sorcery, this eye-shaped geometric lens represents something infinitely more volatile. It's the cosmic zipper, a structural weakness in the fabric of space-time and the ultimate interdimensional portal. To understand the terrifying mechanics of this layout, one must turn to the Typhonian current codified by occultist Kenneth Grant, who expanded on Aleister Crowley's system to explore the terrifying extra-dimensional source of magical energy. Grant posited that reality is shadowed by Universe B, the Sitra Ara, or the other side being the other side of the Kabbalistic tree of life. This isn't merely a place of human evil, but a chaotic, pre-creative trans-Yogothian void populated by Lovecraftian intelligences, ancient Atlantean demons, and cosmic entities that exist entirely outside the linear timeline of human history. According to this theory, the Whitechapel killings were a highly coordinated, industrial exercise in cosmic engineering. The goal wasn't to satisfy the bloodlust of a lone madman, but to systematically weaponize human biology and urban geography to physically tear the perimeters of Universe A, creating a permanent bleeding rupture through which the monstrosities of Universe B could flood into our reality. This dark framework reveals the calculated, horrific logic behind the selection of the victims. The streetwalkers of Whitechapel were not chosen out of convenience. Within the twisted paradigm of the mega ritual, they were targeted as precision, sex magical batteries. In higher level esoteric systems, the womb is the ultimate terrestrial mirror of the cosmic gateway, the literal point where non-physical consciousness crosses into three-dimensional matter. By targeting vulnerable women who operated daily at the intersection of raw, survival-driven sexual energy and severe societal trauma, the orchestrators of the rituals were manipulating a highly potent form of corrupted Kundalini energy. The systematic surgical evisceration of their bodies was an alchemical inversion of creation. The horrific extraction of specific reproductive organs, most notoriously the uterus of Martha Tabram, Annie Chapman, and Mary Jane Kelly, was a literal harvesting of the biological matrix of life force. The uterus and the kidneys, traditionally viewed in ancient Chinese and Western Hermetic medicine as the reservoirs of ancestral Jing, or foundational vital essence, were extracted to serve as physical biological grounding wire for the interdimensional portal. By taking these organs and rearranging them in inverted alignments across the pavement, the killer was constructing an organic tesseract. He was trying to catch the raw, agonizing spark of life force at the exact moment of death, converting the victim's pain into a massive psychic explosion powerful enough to shatter the localized laws of physics and force the geometric lines of the vesica piscis to snap open. This geometric machine achieved its critical operational velocity on the night of September 30th, 1888, during the famous double event. The brutal slaughters of Elizabeth Stride in Dutfield's Yard and Catherine Eddowes at Meter Square, executed miles apart within hours of each other, represented the simultaneous drawing of the two overlapping spheres of the vesica piscis. Stride's death anchored the first operational circle. Eddowes' death anchored the second. The killer himself, moving through the fog-shrouded streets between these two crime scenes, acted as the moving point of intersection, the living needle weaving the thread of blood that bound the two dimensions together. The Eddowes murder site in Meter Square is particularly telling. It was a literal high place of London psychogeography, sitting on a boundary line that historical researchers note forms a perfect alignment with the city's ancient Roman walls and medieval power centers. The removal of Eddowes' heart was the ultimate crowning consecration of this geometric node. The heart was not a trophy. It was the emotional and rhythmic governor of the biological body, sacrificed to act as the spiritual compass required to stabilize the chaotic, blinding frequencies of Universe B as they began to crystallize within the urban grid of the East End. So what then was intended to crawl through this blood-greased gateway? What horrific intelligence was the Whitechapel mega-ritual designed to summon into our world? Esoteric researchers suggest several terrifying overlapping possibilities. First, we have the Nephilim restoration. The ritual was a direct continuation of the transmission of forbidden knowledge that Sir Charles Warren had mapped out on the heights of Mount Hermon. By building a proxy of the Hermon portal in the heart of the British Empire, the orchestrators were attempting to awaken the sleeping egregores, Grigori, Watchers, what have you, the fallen Watchers and their monstrous extra-dimensional Nephilim offspring, re-anchoring their chaotic antediluvian sorcery directly into the bloodstream of modern industrial civilization. Then you have the Imperial Egregore, a.k.a. the Leviathan. The ritual was a grand parapolitical invocation of an archontic overlord, a massive non-physical demonic entity meant to personify and occupy the British Empire itself. Just as the Bible speaks of the Prince of Persia or the Prince of Gracia as territorial demonic principalities ruling over ancient empires, the Whitechapel murders were designed to stitch a terrifying multidimensional entity onto the crown of Great Britain. This gargantuan psychic parasite would feed on the global slaughter, colonialism, and industrial exploitation of the empire, transforming the British state into a literal global engine of clifothic energy. Then there's the Enochian Choronzon wave. The killings were a reckless application of the Enochian magic system, originally channeled by Elizabethan magus Dr. John Dee and Edward Cauliflower Ears Kelly in the 16th century. Within this framework, Whitechapel was a systematic execution of the Aethers, specifically designed to shatter the outer ring of cosmic defenses and let loose Choronzon, the legendary demon of dispersion who guards the abyss. By carving the sigils of the Enochian cults into the living flesh of London, the architects were trying to dissolve the rational mind of humanity, inducing a permanent multi-generational state of psychological fragmentation and spiritual blindness. This deep-level synthesis is exactly why these concepts have vibrated so intensely through modern counterculture, directly inspiring the reality-warping narratives of comic book visionaries like Alan Moore or Grant Morrison. In his masterworks like The Invisibles and Doom Patrol, Morrison treats reality not as a fixed material absolute, but as a plastic linguistic thought form that can be aggressively hacked, reprogrammed, and altered through the precision application of geometric sigils and hyperfictional rituals. Morrison's work serves as a modern pop occult validation of what the architects of Whitechapel already knew in 1888, that symbols are functional machinery. And if you draw the right lines in the right medium, the world will bend. The vesica piscis theory ultimately solves the final great mystery of the Jack the Ripper case, its abrupt and sudden cessation. Traditional criminologists argue the killer died, was incarcerated, or left the country. But the esoteric truth is far more chilling. The killings didn't fail. They succeeded. Once Mary Jane Kelly's body was transformed into a completely hollowed-out, fragmented monument of non-Euclidean geometry inside the pitch-black room of Miller's Court, the final mathematical equation was solved. The Tesseract was complete. The silvered backing of the looking glass was permanently set with blood, and the portal between Universe A and Universe B was successfully cracked open. The killing ceased simply because the machine had done its work, leaving the world to wonder about a monster in the fog, completely blind to the fact that the fabric of their reality had been permanently torn asunder. To fully grasp the ultimate terrifying scope of the Whitechapel mega ritual, we must synthesize these historical threads into a single comprehensive architectural prophecy. This is the grand field theory of Megalopolimancy. The understanding that the modern city isn't a passive collection of steel, concrete, and human bodies, but a living, breathing occult organism. Within this framework, the Jack the Ripper murders weren't an isolated event, but the initial foundational strike of a century-long sorceress working designed to transform London into a physical hypermonculus, a colossal, citywide golem built to serve as the physical vessel for an archontic entity clawing its way through from Universe B. The etymological roots of this working trace directly back to Sir Charles Warren's survey of Mount Hermon and the Book of Enoch. The heavenly beings who descended to rebel against divine law were called the Watchers, a term translated into Greek as egregoroi, the linguistic and metaphysical foundation of the modern occult concept of the egregore. An egregore is a non-physical collective thought form born from the concentrated intent of a group, which eventually achieves autonomous, independent consciousness. But a watcher is fundamentally defined by its gaze. By anchoring the Hermon frequency into the urban layout of London, the architects of the Ripper murders were establishing a terrestrial manifestation of the all-seeing evil eye, the eye of providence, the Illuminati triangle, the unblinking gaze of the cosmic demiurge. In high-level ritual magic, an entity or demon must always be conjured inside a strictly defined operational ritual circle to manifest, trap, and bind its energy to a specific space. Megalopolimancy simply scales this ancient laboratory up to the size of a metropolis. London's winding streets, its ancient Roman walls, and its modern administrative boundaries were weaponized to act as the drawing lines of a massive citywide ritual circle. The city itself became an immense stone occult circuit board, engineered to route the life force of millions of citizens into specific esoteric pathways. As the city evolved, this occult circuit board required a more advanced mechanism to lock the conjured egregore into the material realm. This was achieved through the deliberate engineering of London as the world's premier surveillance state. The millions of CCTV cameras, automated license plate readers, and facial recognition scanners that blanket modern London aren't tools of public safety. They're the physical manifestations of a quantum observational panopticon. In quantum mechanics, the act of observation collapses the wave function, locking fluid, infinite probabilities into a single, fixed material reality. By placing the city under the unblinking electronic glare of a digital panopticon, the orchestrators are using technology to mimic the oppressive gaze of the Gnostic black iron prison or the illusory veil of Maya. This continuous mechanical observation acts as the collective evil eye, freezing human consciousness in a low-vibrational material simulation and permanently fastening the malevolent genius loci, the dark spirit of the city, to the physical architecture of London. This hidden geographical sorcery relies heavily on what parapolitical researcher James Shelby Downer defined as occult topographies, the deliberate execution of ritual events at specific, symbolically charged geographical coordinates to alter human history. Downer famously exposed this in his analysis of the JFK assassination, King Kill 33, demonstrating how the layout of Dealey Plaza was used as a hyper-ritual stage. This exact methodology was mirrored over a century after Whitechapel in the psychogeographical assassination of Princess Diana beneath Paris on the Pont de Alma. The crash was not an accident, but a highly coordinated public ritual executed at an ancient Merovingian sacrificial site, the Bridge of the Soul. Diana was hunted into that subterranean tunnel by the frantic, hypermedia glare of the paparazzi. the unblinking, blinding eye of the basilisk flashbulb. This modern media context served as a high-tech refinement of the Ripper's blade, using a synchronized explosion of light and trauma to anchor a massive global hypersigil into the collective consciousness of humanity, permanently shifting the metaphysical frequency of the Western world. London stands today as the completed operational prototype of this dark urban evolution. It's a fully functioning hypermunculus, its streets acting as the veins, its surveillance grid acting as the nervous system, and the infernal entity summoned from Universe B acting as its singular guiding soul. But the working doesn't stop with London. London was merely the primary predecessor, the blueprint designed to dictate the future course of human civilization around the globe, from the sprawling concrete grids of Tokyo and New York to the emergent, hyper-monitored megacities of the developing world. The exact same megalopolimantic templates are being systematically deployed. Other archontic and demiurgic intelligences are waiting in the wings of Universe B, preparing to breach the veil and inhabit the looming urban landscapes of tomorrow. As we've seen, the Jack the Ripper murders can be interpreted through multiple lenses. Sorry. I'm just throwing out theories. I don't 100% believe in any of this stuff. A lot of it, you could say, is kind of like, yeah, a lot of it makes a good deal of sense to me, but I don't 100% believe in any of these theories as an end-all be-all. I'm just throwing out stuff that other people have said, and then a few things that I've thought, or a combination thereof. But yes, it can be interpreted through numerous lenses, each revealing different aspects of the case while raising new questions. Whether we view them as state-sponsored terrorism, occult ritual, or interdimensional engineering, one thing remains clear. These weren't random acts of violence, but carefully planned operations with specific objectives. The Black Ops theory explains the political context of the murders and their apparent utility to established powers. The occult theories accounts for the ritualistic elements and symbolic significance. The looking glass theory explores the psychological dimensions of the case and their connections to Victorian scientific and philosophical currents. The vesicopiscus theory provides a framework for understanding the geometric patterns encoded in the murder sites and their possible function as interdimensional gateways. What unites these theories is their recognition that the Ripper murders weren't just crimes, but communications. Messages encoded in violence, designed to be heard by those with ears to hear, seen by those who've honed true sight. Whether that knowledge belonged to government agents, occult practitioners, or interdimensional explorers, the murders function as a complex text that continues to reveal new meanings with each interpretation. The Ripper murders remain the ultimate occult mega-ritual, an event where the boundaries between political conspiracy, secret societies, sacred geometry, and metaphysical horror dissolve. The legacy of these murders is more than a mystery. It's a blueprint for the psycho-geographic wars that continue to shape cities, power, and the human psyche. In the aftermath, London itself became a haunted engine. Its streets, tunnels, and monuments forever marked by the blood and symbols of the Ripper's unseen hand. The city's occult landscape was permanently altered, with new ley lines of power established and new gateways opened between dimensions. As we navigate our own cities today, we might do well to remember that the architecture around us, streets, buildings, and monuments that define our urban environment, might contain hidden symbols and encoded messages that we're only just now beginning to understand. The Ripper murders can remind us that cities aren't just physical spaces, but psychic ones, where battles for reality itself might be waged in blood and shadow. Seeing as how I'm at 2.5 hours, we're going to cut it there. Like I said, I've got a final wrap-up addendum that kind of takes all the Megalopolimancy stuff explored over the last 3 episodes and just kind of puts a little bow on it. But, yeah, this kind of got away from me to a degree because just all the weird, crazy theories surrounding the Ripper murders. Like, I went into this with just the mega ritual idea. And then, like, when I remember, like, the whole Dodgson, Lewis Carroll as a Ripper suspect thing came to me when I was, like, messing around with this stuff. And I was like, oh, my God. And then certain things, like, that's the most ridiculous one, but it's also the funnest one. So I had a lot of fun putting that together and just, like, linking it to a lot of prevailing thoughts and ideas that were occurring in that time frame and surrounding these events. So, but yeah, anyway, that's going to wrap it up for this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun doing this one. Sorry it's a little late than usual. Like I said, I had to rewrite this a few times. There's also some geopolitically sensitive ideas that I had to make sure I was getting across relatively diplomatically, we'll say. Diplomatically, that's a good word. Okay, we'll go with that. Also, sorry about my voice towards the end. I got to get better about staying hydrated as I'm going through this stuff. And somewhere not too far down the line, the United States of America will be getting this same treatment. So, you know, UK, don't feel like I'm picking on you guys or anything. It's not too far down the road. But yeah, anywho. This has been Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclast, the podcast. I'm your host, Michael Ucht. You guys are the fucking bomb. I love you all. Thanks for listening. Thanks for subscribing. Hope to see a lot more of that in the days going forward. And yeah, peace out, you guys. See you on the next one.